receptionist if Captain Spears was still there. Informed he was, she rapped on his doorframe once, opened the door, and rushed into his office. "Captain, you aren't going to believe this, but WNOF just called. They say the news is all over the internet that the Chinese are going to bomb the base. Their phones are ringing off the hooks. They want a comment from us." Captain Spears' face went dead white. He had to swallow twice to get enough composure to say, "If they are, they haven't told us about it." "The internet," Heidi Fritsch declared bitterly, and trotted back toward her office and the waiting telephone. Butler Spears buried his face in his hands. 2 minutes later, when he felt a bit more composed, he checked his Rolodex, picked up his telephone, and called Washington. Back in her office, Heidi Fritsch's phones were ringing constantly. As quickly as her yeoman could field a call on one line, explain about the security exercise, and hang up, the phone rang again. Heidi took a call from a man who said he was the manager of a large hotel. He named it, in Virginia Beach. "We're hosting a convention of Vietnam vets. They're lined up at the desk 10 deep trying to check out. What the hell was going on out there at the base?" "A routine security exercise." "Not according to the internet." "We don't run the internet. We're just trying to run our little corner of the Navy." She hung up and fielded the next call, which was from the PAO at Naval Air Station Oceana. "Heidi, the phones are ringing off the hook over here. Some of my staff have received emails saying that the naval base is preparing for a nuclear attack from the Chinese." "For God's sake!" "They say it's Pearl Harbor all over again." Involuntarily, Heidi looked out her window. Sunlight and shadow were marching across the lawn. The flag flapped vigorously on its pole. Beyond the roof of the next building, she could see superstructures and masts festooned with radars and antennae of ships at the carrier piers. A helicopter went by overhead. Cars and trucks on the streets. "No one is bombing anything here," she shouted into the phone. "We're having a routine security exercise that's been planned for 2 months and announced to the public. Read your damn messages and get a goddamn grip." She slammed the phone down. Anastasia Roberts broke the news to Jake Grafton. "We've received a call from the Pentagon. They're fielding inquiries from various networks and newspapers. It seems the internet is full of messages saying that the Chinese are about to attack the Norfolk naval base. ICBMs are in the air, there are bombs hidden on the base. It's Pearl Harbor all over again. The stuff has gone viral on Facebook and Twitter, and presumably every other internet site on the planet." Jake Grafton just stared at her. So she went on. "The public in the area around the base is panicked. Massive traffic jams of people trying to get the hell out. Cell phone towers are overloaded. People are driving the wrong way on the interstate lanes. Lots of accidents. Some of the hospitals and nursing homes are demanding help to evacuate their patients." He made a face. "The Pentagon has told everyone that the base is having a routine security exercise that's been planned for months. Maybe some people believe that, but a lot of people don't." "I wonder if the Watcher will," he thought. "And Sal Molina is on line 1. Anastasia Roberts wheeled and left the office. Jake picked up his phone and pushed the button for line 1. "Yes, Sal. Have you heard the latest from Norfolk?" "Yes. The president told the press officer to try to calm the media. He told me to call you and ask, what the fuck, over?" Anastasia stuck her head back through the door. She mouthed, "CNO on line 2. "I have another call, Sal. I'll get right back to you." "Okay." Cart McKiernan said, "Norfolk is a meltdown. The news got out somehow. Maybe not, but rumors are flying thick and fast. They're on the internet and now television and radio. I'm going down there on a chopper from the Pentagon in about an hour. You want to go?" "Yes, I'll bring Sal Molina." So he called Molina back, cut him short, and said, "Admiral McKiernan and I are going to Norfolk. You want to go?" Molina didn't hesitate. "Yes. See you at the Pentagon helipad in an hour. Bring a toothbrush." Jake called Harley Merritt and gave him a quick brief, told his secretary to alert his driver and security team, then went into his office bathroom and threw some things into his overnight bag. When he was in the limo on the way to the Pentagon, he called his wife and told her he wouldn't be home tonight. "I've been watching the television, Jake. Are you going to Norfolk?" "Yes." "Dear God Almighty, Callie said. Although she was certainly no internet junkie and didn't own a cell phone, Sally Chan heard about the panic in mid-afternoon from the television set above the bar in her father's restaurant. The place was unusually empty. She had the place settings on all the tables. Her father was cooking in the kitchen. Her mother was behind the bar inventorying the liquor, wine, and beer. Mrs. Chan had turned on the television for the company. Sally happened to glance at it, saw the news ribbon scrolling across the bottom, and paused to read it. An afternoon soap opera was playing. U.S. Navy spokesmen at Naval Base Norfolk and in the Pentagon have denied that the security exercise at the base is in any way related to the internet rumor that a Chinese nuclear weapon is hidden on the naval base. There was more. Within 60 seconds, the network interrupted the program to air a live interview with the White House press secretary. Sally stepped behind the bar and turned up the volume. He was loose, smiling, as if all this were a big joke. Debunking internet rumors will be a new career for me. Sally changed channels, got a local station, which was airing footage shot from a helicopter of massive traffic jams on the interstates leading to the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel and the tunnel under Hampton Roads. She and her mother stood mesmerized, watching the camera pan from a height of perhaps 500 feet. Cars jammed the roadways as far as the camera could see. A breathless local announcer confirmed that people were fleeing the area as quickly as the roads allowed. Hospitals and nursing homes were demanding transport for patients. Now the camera depicted a demonstration that was almost a riot in front of Norfolk City Hall by a mixed-race crowd. One demonstrator, a fat woman, demanded the authorities transport people from the area who didn't own cars. "Get some buses!" she shouted into the camera. "Get some city buses and get us out of here! Don't leave us to die like you did the poor people during Katrina." Katrina was the last big hurricane to slam New Orleans. There was more of the same on other channels. Bedlam. Mass panic. Sally turned off the audio of the idiot tube and poured 2 glasses of wine. "What does it mean?" Mrs. Chan asked, fingering her glass. "I don't know," Sally answered. She sat on a bar stool to drink hers. "The Chinese again," Mrs. Chan said with contempt. "Why do they always blame the Chinese? We are good Americans. We work hard and send our children to college and pay our taxes. We are good Americans, as good as anybody." Sally wasn't listening. She was thinking about Choi Lee, supposedly retired from California High Tech, yet he never talked about California or his life or work there. Perhaps there was a failed love affair. But why had he crossed the country to live here? And why did he do nothing, except fish? Then there was Zhang Ping, who spoke essentially no English. Why was he here? A pal from California, Choi said. Yet Zhang said little, even to Choi, except to occasionally ask him to pass along a compliment on the excellence of the family's food. He fished, too. In the light of the almost unbelievable accusations about diabolical Chinese intentions at the naval base, all these little things became larger, more ominous. Who were Zhang and Choi? If they weren't spies, why were they here? But the whole thing is ridiculous, Sally Chan told herself. A Chinese attack on the Norfolk naval base? That would start World War III, wouldn't it? Torn by indecision, she watched the news. After a bit, the local station stopped showing traffic jams and stories about panicked old people at nursing homes and poor people in the ghetto, and showed a photo of 5 carriers and 2 amphibious assault ships at the carrier piers during the Christmas holidays 2 years ago. So how many carriers were going to be here this Christmas? According to the television news person, someone had asked that question of the Pentagon and had been rebuffed. "We never talk about future ship movements," a man in a blue uniform said on camera. Sally Chan decided to call Choi Lee. She dialed his cell, and the call didn't go through. She tried again. Nothing. The 4th time his phone rang. After 5 rings, the call rolled to his voicemail. "Call me when you can," she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. The super story of the day hit the Chinese embassy in Washington like an incoming missile. No one there knew anything about the voyage of Ocean Holiday or the mission of Lieutenant Commander Zhang Ping, both of which were tightly held military secrets. The staff put out a press release denying the rumors as vicious smears and reported all this to Beijing in encrypted flash messages. Of course, the Chinese Foreign Ministry there had their own internet sources, so they knew all about it. The answer came back to the Chinese embassy in Washington 30 minutes after it was sent. The ambassador was to announce that he was going to Norfolk to tell everyone that China was being foully smeared by outrageous internet lies and to reassure the citizens there. And then he was to go. Immediately. In the meantime, the embassy press officer was to point out to the American media that an outrageous slander like this one about the Americans would never be allowed on the internet in China. While all this was going on, Zhang Ping started his boat toward the mouth of the Elizabeth River. He had to use the channel over the Hampton Roads Tunnel. The radar reflectors at each side of the channel showed nicely on his radar screen. As he closed the distance, Choi Lee pointed out the traffic backed up on the access road to the tunnel on Willoughby Spit. Zhang used his binoculars. He could see that traffic was stopped. Trucks, cars, vans, everything. Flashing lights on police cars. A helicopter, no, 2 helicopters, hovering near the tunnel entrance. He passed the binoculars to Choi, who focused, scanned the scene, then handed them back. "An accident in the tunnel," Choi explained. "This happens often. Last week the car sat for an hour before a wrecker could get through from the other end to remove the cars." Zhang recalled the incident. "Americans have too many cars," he said dismissively, and turned his binoculars to the amphibious assault ship and her escorting destroyers, which were ahead of him going through the channel over the tunnel. A harbor patrol craft was following the procession. Its machine gun was unmanned. Zhang wondered how long it would take for the crew of the patrol boat to go to action stations and man the weapon, if they were told to do so. Choi Lee turned on his cell phone. It refused to log on to the cellular network. Another day in America, he thought. Chapter 22. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. Winston Churchill. It was early in the morning in China when Admiral Wu was summoned to the capital to meet with the paramount leader at a session of the Central Military Commission. The staff was monitoring the media reaction in the United States to the Internet rumors, of which they had translated quite a sample. The plan had not included a contingency for the Americans getting advance warning of the Chinese stealth attack on their ships, only 2 of which were actually at the carrier piers. Tomorrow, the 18th of December in America, the men gathered around the table were told. The 3rd one was scheduled to arrive. The final 2 would arrive on the 20th and 22nd. All 3 were in the Atlantic with their task forces bound for the entrance to the Chesapeake. The choices were obvious. Abort the attack, detonate the bomb as soon as possible, or await the carriers and detonate it then. "Does the American Navy know the weapon is there?" the paramount leader asked the head of the intelligence service, who was in attendance. "We have received no indication that they know, or even suspect. They are checking the waters around the base, have tightened security, but we knew they would do that. There is no indication they are doing anything that we didn't think they would do. However, the local cell towers around Norfolk are out of service. A technical problem, the telephone company said." "Could these internet rumors convince them that there is a weapon there?" The intelligence chief didn't think much of that possibility. In his experience, the American military and political leaders used facts to make their decisions, or what they thought were facts. Frightened people who knew nothing sending texts and emails and making Facebook and Twitter posts wouldn't sway them. "The internet there is totally open," the spy chief explained. "People routinely use the internet to accuse the political leaders of every crime known to man. Everything up to and including treason, every hour of every day. The people in government ignore all that. The media ignore it. Their attitude is that if one ignores the internet, it doesn't matter what is on it." The paramount leader didn't share that viewpoint, nor did the other officials in the room. In China, an open internet could easily undermine support for the party, they thought. People who slandered the party in any forum were public enemies. Yet he realized this enormous gust of cyber wind was happening in America, not here. Admiral Wu, your opinion. As long as the United States Navy doesn't believe a bomb is really there, the ships will come into their berths at the carrier piers. If the admirals believe a bomb is there, the ships will be diverted elsewhere. We are monitoring their naval traffic and the internal naval traffic in the Pentagon. So far, we have seen nothing to that effect. So your recommendation is to wait, at least until the third carrier berths. Then we can reevaluate. But I say to you now, the repercussions of our attack will be vast. Our position must be that an American weapon accidentally exploded. The Americans never admit that nuclear weapons are aboard their ships, and everyone knows that they are. Their evasions will help destroy their credibility. The presence of our ambassador and his death will help sell the story of an accident. Nothing that has happened in America, or will happen, leads me to believe the current administration will ask Congress to declare war. No one declares war anymore, the paramount leader said unequivocally. War declared or undeclared would cause the current American administration to be thrown from office, Admiral Wu insisted. They know that. It will be the pole upon which all their thinking turns. 2 carriers are a small return for our effort and the risk. 3 would be better. 5 would make the gamble worthwhile. Let us not forget why this mission was authorized. What do your men in Norfolk say? The paramount leader asked the admiral. We have heard nothing from them. There are 2 agents there, except routine internet posts. The latest was yesterday. We cannot get through to them today since the cellular network around Norfolk is out of service. Temporarily. The telephone company says it is severely overloaded, jammed with internet traffic, so has been temporarily shut down. A chuckle went around the room. The paramount leader didn't chuckle. Could the Americans have captured the agents and be playing us? To what end? The intelligence chief asked. That would be illogical. After all, if they have the men and the weapon, nothing will happen. Our attack will be a non-event. We are sitting here wasting our time. The chairman lit a cigarette and smoked it in silence. Everyone in the room sat silently, too. A war with America would stop the Chinese economy dead in its tracks. Even an embargo of Chinese exports to America would be devastating. An embargo of all China's imports and exports would be something less than total war, but it would cause the nation to run out of oil and food. Yet there was a small chance it would ever come to that. Even if the Americans knew the Chinese had pulled the trigger, they could plausibly deny that they knew. Could and probably would. On the other hand, the Chinese people wanted China to be a major regional power. China needed the oil, natural gas, and fish from adjacent seas. Its people demanded that other nations in the region respect them, their flag, their achievements, and their ambitions. If that didn't happen, the rot would eventually set in, and the future of the party would be in doubt. Lead or get run over. When he stubbed out his cigarette, the paramount leader spoke conversationally to everyone in the room. We will wait another day. As the Marine helicopter flew the 125 nautical miles south from the Pentagon helipad to Chambers Field at Naval Base Norfolk, Jake Grafton ignored the crew chatter on the intercom. He was thinking about the Chinese. If they planted a bomb in Norfolk, and it did indeed explode, he thought they had seriously underestimated the reaction of the American people afterward. The Japanese certainly did when they planned the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, lo those 70-some years ago. A large segment of the American population then was willing to exterminate the Japanese race from the planet. Admiral Bull Halsey caught the mood when he said, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." Total war. Absolute total war. At the least, the Communist Party would be finished in China, and chaos would once again cause the death of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in China. That explosion would irrevocably transform America. Into what, Jake didn't know, but his head and heart told him the republic that had lasted since 1789 would probably not survive. When the chopper settled on the tarmac, he roused himself from his meditations. Finally, the engines died and the rotors stopped. He followed the Admiral, his 2 aides, and Sal Molina down the little stairway to the concrete. One of the CNO's aides, a woman, was a rear admiral. The other was a captain. Captain Butler Spears and the admiral in charge of Fleet Forces Command, Sherman Fitch, were waiting to salute McKiernan. Inside the little operations building, Spears led his visitors to a conference room, where one of the news networks was playing on a television. Admiral Fitch grabbed the remote and killed the television audio. "The situation is totally out of control," he said. "Here and clear to Richmond. Everyone within 100 miles is trying to get the hell out of here, including half our sailors. I have never in my life seen anything like it. Did you see the highways as you flew in? The interstates are giant parking lots, creep and go, for 100 miles in every direction. Accidents everywhere. Riots in downtown Norfolk, Portsmouth, Suffolk, and Newport News. Looting has started. The police can't control the mobs." "None of that is our problem," McKiernan said. "Our problem is a bomb. Have you found it?" He addressed that question to them both. "Every ship has been searched," Fitch said. "A quick going over. Now they're emptying the storerooms and inspecting the bilges. Every ship in my command. Nothing that shouldn't be there except some marijuana and a couple of stills running on fruit juice." "We're about halfway through searching the base," Spears reported. "We've been through every building and are doing the manholes. The warehouses will take at least 2 more days to search with the people we have. SEALs are searching the piers and river and offshore with no luck. We've even had a destroyer search with the new sonar. Nothing yet." "Have you told your people what they're looking for?" Sal Molina asked the naval officers. "We told them that a shape, a dummy weapon, had been hidden, and that was what we were looking for," Spears said. "We're now looking for a lost diamond ring or somebody's poodle." Fitch nodded. "I told the skippers what they were searching for." "That's how the secret got out," McKiernan said heavily to Molina. To Spears and Fitch, he said, "You both made the right decision. In the age of the Internet, it was an impossible secret to keep." "I suppose," Sal Molina said unhappily. He pulled his cell phone from his coat pocket, saw that he had no service, and went out to find an empty room with a hardwired telephone so he could call the White House. "The question is," Jake Grafton said, "what the Chinese reaction will be. They haven't detonated the bomb yet, but they may decide to do so in the next minute, hour, day, or week. We've got to turn those ships around." "We're screwed if we do," Jake said. "The instant the Chinese get wind of that, they may pop the thing. Why wait? You know as well as I do they're waiting for more ships. The Lincoln will be here tomorrow." "I know, and they do too." "What remains to be done?" McKiernan asked Spears and Fitch. "To find the bomb, or bombs. Are we looking at a day, a week, a month? How long?" "We need to get a SEAL boss, Joe Child, in here." "Call him." Child was there in 5 minutes. He had been in Spears's offices looking for him and been told he was in base ops at Chambers Field, so he had been on the way. They were discussing what remained to be searched when Molina came back. Another helicopter settled on the ramp outside the building. Jake heard it, glanced through the window, and saw Harry Estep and National Security Advisor Jurgen Schultz walking quickly toward the ops building. Molina saw them too. They came into the conference room without fanfare and grabbed seats around the table. "What the fuck is going on around here?" Schultz demanded. "We're trying to figure that out," McKiernan answered coolly. "All this crap about a Chinese bomb. What evidence is there that there is a Chinese bomb?" Harry Estep asked harshly. "Or a bomb, period." Several people started to talk at once, but Molina silenced them all without even raising his voice. "There isn't enough evidence to convince a jury of anything beyond a reasonable doubt," he said. "But this isn't a court of law. There is enough evidence to convince me, and the President, that the Chinese government may be plotting an attack on the United States, or another country or group may be planning an attack that we will blame on the Chinese,
I don't know if there is more than one chance in 1,000 that there's a bomb, but I guarantee you if one explodes, the aftermath will be absolutely catastrophic. Now let's cut the bullshit and figure out what the United States government is going to do to prevent an explosion. Admiral McKiernan.
The CNO looked at Joe Child and Butler Spears.
How long to complete the search?
To an absolute certainty, a month, Child said. McKiernan made an angry gesture.
None of that. I want the bomb found by noon tomorrow.
He looked at his watch.
You have 19 hours. You two go get at it.
Yes, sir, they said almost in unison, then rose and left the room. When the door closed, Schultz said, It doesn't really matter what you want. What about all these people on the base? What about the 2 million people in the metropolitan area?
I'm not God. I'm doing what I can do,
McKiernan shot back. If our mad bombers are after the ships, why not get the ones that are here underway and stop any more from coming in? McKiernan introduced his senior aide.
This is Rear Admiral Suzanne Dighton. She's in charge of the Navy's IT systems. Admiral?
Dighton didn't hem and haw. The Chinese have been reading our operational stuff for several years. Our latest analysis is that they may also be reading our encrypted message traffic.
For the love of God, Schultz roared. And you have done nothing about it?
McKiernan didn't turn a hair. He cast a cold eye on the National Security Advisor.
Don't play innocent with me. Your staff has been told all about this problem. We do what we can with the money in our budget and the people we have or can hire. This isn't the time or place to cut up the corpse.
Molina said smoothly,
Admiral Grafton, your opinion, please.
Jake Grafton's gaze circled the room. If we tell our carrier battle groups to go somewhere else or remain at sea, the Chinese may learn of it and instruct the trigger man or men to blow the weapon. There will be no profit in waiting. On the other hand, if we bring all these ships in here and then they blow it, we have just screwed ourselves.
That's the problem in a nutshell, Molina said softly. Thank you, Jake.
The meeting broke up then. However, McKiernan, Grafton, and Molina made no move to leave their chairs. The CNO signaled to Admiral Fitch to remain. When everyone else had left, McKiernan said to Fitch, I want you to put senior officers on 2 CODs, carrier onboard delivery planes, and have them fly out to the carriers that are due in on the 20th and 22nd. The admirals are to be told orally that they are to remain at sea until further orders. Nothing over the air, encrypted or otherwise. No crew internet. No ship-to-ship voice. Absolute radio silence.
Aye, aye, sir. What about the Lincoln, which is coming in tomorrow?
McKiernan and Jake Grafton exchanged glances.
Let her come, Jake said softly. The Chinese expect her.
Cart McKiernan nodded. He was a gambler, too. Zhang Ping used his binoculars when he was in the mouth of the Elizabeth River, only half a mile from the carrier piers. He ignored the 2 giant carriers berthed there, and the amphibious assault ship covered with helicopters, and studied the harbor craft. One seemed to be anchored. The whaler was barely moving, to make it a more stable platform for viewing with binoculars. Still, the boat's motion made it difficult to discern details. He concentrated fiercely. As he watched, a man wearing a black wetsuit and scuba gear came out of the water. People on deck helped him with his gear. He knew what they were doing, searching the water around the carrier piers, inspecting the bottoms of the ships, searching. A harbor patrol craft came his way. Zhang put the binoculars in his lap. A man on a loudhailer shouted something in English. Choi Li translated. This area is closed. Turn around. Zhang Ping wheeled the whaler into a tight turn, pointed her north, and added throttle. The twin 225-horsepower Mercury outboard engines began to sing. The whaler came up on the plane. Well, Zhang thought, they are taking precautions. They are alert, yet they are searching in the wrong place. By the time they get to the right place, it will be too late. Sally Chan was worried. Choi Lee hadn't returned her call, and when she tried to call him, the cellular network was dead. The call wouldn't go through. There was no ringtone, nothing. High-tech junk. The restaurant was empty. Her mother had gone home because there was nothing for her to do. The other waitress hadn't come in, and probably wouldn't. Perhaps she was in the traffic jam for one of the tunnels or highways out. Sally was sitting at the bar nursing a glass of wine when the window in the dining area next to the parking lot exploded. Glass showered across a dozen tables. As she went to look, she heard a revving engine and squealing tires. She found a brick under one of the tables. Only a few shards of glass remained in the window. The breeze came in the broken window. Her father came from the kitchen to see what had happened. He too had been following the panic by checking the television occasionally. "We're Chinese," he said, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. "That's enough for some people." "Stupid teenagers," Sally said. She went for the broom and dustpan. The good news was that behind the restaurant and the area where the garbage cans were kept were 6 sheets of plywood under an overhang, for whenever a hurricane threatened. There hadn't been one in years, yet the plywood had been there since the last storm because eventually, someday, another storm would come. That's life, Sally thought. A storm always comes sooner or later. She began looking around for the hammer and nails. She had finished nailing plywood over the broken window opening and was putting the hammer away when the telephone in the restaurant rang. She raced for it and grabbed the thing off its cradle. "Hey, beautiful," he said breezily. "Just got into port. My cell phone isn't working." "Where have you been?" "Fishing. With Zhang. Why?" "Have you talked to anyone? Watched any television?" "No." "The Tidewater area is in meltdown. The roads are packed with people fleeing the area. The rumor on the television and internet is that the Chinese have a bomb planted at the Norfolk naval base and are going to explode it. All hell has broken loose." Silence. Then Choi's voice. "When we get the boat put away, I'll come over. You're going to stay at the restaurant, right?" "Yes." "See you in a while," he said distractedly and broke the connection. Sally stared at the phone for a moment, then put it in her pocket. That tone in his voice, that had been ominous. Oh, she thought, I am just being foolish. Choi Lee is a good man. He wouldn't be a part of mass murder. My God, a vicious rumor, and you are suspecting everyone. Sally, get a grip. She went back to the bar and made herself a gin and tonic with a slice of lime. Her father came in from the kitchen. "Go home," she told him. "Mom probably needs you with her." "We're closed," he said. He kissed her and walked to the front door, turned the sign so it read closed, and manipulated the lock so that it latched the door behind him. Sally sipped her drink. After a bit, she turned off the television and sat in silence, staring at the interior of the little business that had supported her family and her for over 20 years. This little piece of America. The telephone call with Sally had given Choi Lee an epiphany. Suddenly, the last 6 months of watching the fleet, Zhang and his boat, it all came into blindingly clear focus. A bomb. To destroy the United States Navy's ships. To destroy the heart of the American fleet. He couldn't imagine how the news got out, nor did he care. It fit. He had no doubt whatsoever. Zhang was still standing in the boat with the fuel hose nozzle in his hand, filling the whaler's tanks. Choi didn't wait to try out his poker face on Zhang. He walked across the parking lot, got into his SUV, started it, and drove away. If exploding a bomb at the naval base was indeed Zhang's mission, and Choi Lee believed it was to a certainty, then Zhang would kill him soon, if he didn't trigger the bomb. When he heard about the news stories, it would be one or the other, as soon as possible. And Choi didn't even have a gun. He headed for the Chan's restaurant through almost empty streets. Everyone was trying to get out of town, Sally had said. Choi had never seen the streets so empty. He made good time, merely slowed at stop signs and zipped along. A bomb. That was it. Yet perhaps when Zhang heard the news, he would merely trigger the bomb. Then Choi and Sally would be instantly dead, along with a couple million other people. For the first time in his life, Choi Lee felt on the edge of death. The eternal darkness was right there before him, and he hadn't even told Sally Chan he loved her. The attendant at the marina did indeed try to tell Zhang Ping about the panic. Zhang didn't understand enough English to make sense of it. He merely smiled and looked around for Choi, who wasn't in sight. Perhaps he went to the restroom. The attendant looked at Zhang strangely, then shrugged and moved off down the pier. Zhang maneuvered the boat into its slip, double-checked that the master switch was off, unhooked the iPad, made sure the bumper pads were in place and the boat was properly tied in its berth, then put covers on everything. Only when he was finished and walking to the parking lot with the iPad in his hand did he wonder what had happened to Choi. He turned on the iPad and discovered he had no internet service. He stood there trying to make sense of it. The iPad got its internet signal from cellular telephone towers. He wondered if the interruption in service was temporary, or if the authorities had turned them off. Perhaps it was just the iPad. He retrieved his cell phone from a trouser pocket and turned it on. No service. In the parking lot, he discovered that Choi's SUV was gone. Zhang had a decision to make, and he made it quickly. He glanced about, looking at parked cars and pickup trucks and SUVs. No one in sight. A car was driving into the lot. The driver got out, then opened the rear door and picked up what looked like a brown paper bag full of beer or groceries. The guy was going out on a boat this evening. Zhang came up behind him, and as he turned, grabbed his head and twisted viciously, breaking the man's neck. The bag fell and split, and 6 packs of beer tumbled out. Zhang fished in the man's right-hand trouser pocket, found the car keys, and shoved the body onto the back seat. The 6 packs he picked up and tossed in. A quick scan around to see if anyone had been watching. No one in sight. Zhang got into the car, inserted the key into the ignition, and drove away. Chapter 23. Everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. Karl von Clausewitz. I was sitting in Sarah Houston's office reading the news from Norfolk on my laptop, while she manipulated her desktop computer, working on God knows what. The news was beyond bad. It was a major shitstorm. The story about a Chinese bomb had been twisted almost beyond recognition, but the kernel of truth was there. I confess I wasn't surprised. A secret this big was too hot to hold. A leak was inevitable. I wondered if Jake Grafton had leaked it. He was capable of it, certainly. He was a damned sneaky bastard, if he thought it would help us find the bomb before it popped. But I couldn't see how it would. I thought the opposite was probably true. There was a little television on a table by the wall. I turned it on to one of the news channels. The politicians were running around with their hair on fire. Massive traffic jams on all the highways out of the Norfolk, Virginia beach area. People were driving the wrong way on the highways, making cops dive for the ditches. Riots in Norfolk and Newport News. After 3 minutes, I strangled the beast. Blessed silence. Only the clicking of Sarah's computer keys. She could silence them, of course, but she hadn't. Maybe the noise helped her focus. After a bit, she stopped to make a note on a pad on her desk, tore off the top sheet, and handed it to me. I looked at it. Cuthbert Gordon, 7354 Vista Del Mar. The city, state, and zip code were on it. In case you have forgotten, old Bertie was my mom's new love interest. Thanks, I said, and tucked the note into my wallet, then put my wallet into my hip pocket, right next to my heart. Sarah got busy again on her keyboard. I sat there relaxed with one leg crossed, thinking about Anna Modine's ashes dribbling into the breeze. My cell phone rang. It was in my shirt pocket. I pulled it out, didn't recognize the number, but answered it anyway. Maybe someone wanted my opinion on the exciting taste of McDonald's latest burger. Grafton's voice. Tommy, I want you to come to Norfolk. I need you. Take a while to drive down there, what with the traffic jams and all. I thought maybe a week would do it. A helicopter will pick you up at the Langley helipad in half an hour. Be on it. Yes, sir. After I had my cell phone back in my pocket, I checked the Kimber in my shoulder holster. Loaded and ready. Zoe Carey's Derringer was in my right sock, also loaded. Put my laptop in my office, make a pit stop on the way to the helicopter, and I would be ready to fly. Sarah stopped tapping and swiveled toward me. "You going somewhere?" "Grafton wants me in Norfolk. He's sending a chopper for me." "That bomb might explode while you're there." I shrugged. She couldn't leave it there. "Don't you have anything to say?" I didn't know what to say. We're all gonna die. That's the way life works. The only issue of any interest is when. I kept my mouth shut. "So aren't you scared? A little bit?" "Should I be?" "Tommy." Seeing the look on her face, I crossed to her, tilted her head up, and kissed her on the lips as sweetly and gently as possible. "See you in a few days, Sarah," I whispered. Walking down the hallway, I felt like a shit. I just didn't have a goodbye scene in me. "Farewell, dear lady, until we meet again, here or on the other side of the Great Divide." Fuck that. Maybe the truth was, I didn't give a good goddamn. The panic in southwestern Virginia hit the White House like an earthquake. Sal Molina and Jurgen Schultz had helicoptered back from Norfolk. Molina thought he could feel the floor oscillating as people ran through the halls on errands that presumably would save civilization. He was summoned to the Situation Room, where the president was huddled with his national security team. Once there, Molina found that Schultz had panicked too. He was in full cry when Sal walked in. "It's that incompetent asshole Grafton and that idiot Admiral McKiernan. Those two fools think they can manage this mess. The hell of it is, there probably is a fucking bomb in the harbor, and those imbeciles sat there talking about finding it. A fucking needle in a fucking haystack. Goddamn chinks. I think we should get the Chinese ambassador in here and tell him that if a nuke goes off in Norfolk, we'll massively retaliate against China. We won't leave two bricks stuck together in that fucking commie paradise. We'll cremate every fucking chink between Vietnam and Mongolia. Every last one of the silly sons of bitches. Men, women, children, and comrades. All of them." When Schultz paused for air, Molina spoke directly to him. "Let me get this straight. You're advising escalating the crisis by threatening the Chinese with all-out nuclear holocaust. They have ICBMs with nuclear warheads, too. What if they decide there's no way off the cliff except to shoot first? Wipe out America and save as many of their people as possible." "They'll back down," Schultz insisted. "What if they don't? Are we bluffing? Would you really do it?" The silence that followed was broken when the president said, "Thank you, Jurgen, for that thoughtful advice. Any more thoughts, Sal?" "Norfolk certainly is in meltdown. Somebody leaked the possibility of a bomb, sure as sin. That was inevitable, I suppose." Molina sighed. "If Grafton and McKiernan can find the thing before it blows, they will. If they can't, I don't think anything we do will matter much. A nuclear explosion in Norfolk, or anywhere else, will have profound, unknown consequences. If it happens, well, I think we had better await the event and go on from there, assuming that there is a United States left that we want to live in." Jurgen Schultz started cussing again. Molina had never before heard a Harvard professor throw around so many of those fine old Anglo-Saxon words. Obviously, Schultz was a connoisseur. Molina thought it a rare treat to hear those words delivered so passionately. When Schultz ran down, the president said, "I don't know about you people, but I'm going to have a nice quiet dinner, drink a couple glasses of wine, and try to get some sleep. I suggest everyone here do the same." "What about the congressmen and senators and the press?" his chief of staff asked. "They're besieging us." The president eyed him. "And your point is?" "We can't." "Oh, yes, we can." The president stood and walked out. Sal Molina didn't linger. He went to his office, stirred through his phone messages, then donned his coat and headed for home. He decided to buy a six-pack on the way and a pizza. He used his cell phone to order the pizza, which the girl assured him would be ready when he arrived. When he got to the pearly gate, St. Peter might ask, "So, how did you spend your last night on Earth?"
"Eating a super supreme pizza and drinking 3 beers, sir. I couldn't think of anything else."
"Did you get the traditional crust?"
"Oh, you bet."
Zhang Ping was on his way to the Chan's restaurant when he passed a convenience store with a telephone kiosk mounted on the wall. America didn't have many of those anymore, not since the dawn of the cell phone age, so it was a rare opportunity. Zhang did a U-turn and went back to the convenience store, which was still open, yet empty, with only the clerk behind the counter. Zhang examined the phone mounted on the wall. The receiver was off the hook, dangling at the end of the line. Someone had pried open the coin box, ruining it. Zhang put the receiver on the hook, waited a few seconds, then put it to his ear. No dial tone. Perhaps there was a telephone in the store. He went into the store, walked to the cooler and selected a soft drink, took it to the counter, saw the phone on the ledge behind. The young male clerk was of mixed race, perhaps a quarter black, with tattoos on his arms and one running up his neck. Zhang put the soft drink on the counter and reached for his wallet with his right hand. The clerk picked up the bottle. That was when Zhang reached with his left hand, grabbed a handful of hair and slammed the man's face down onto the counter. With his right hand, he delivered a karate chop to the neck. He heard the bones snap. He pushed the clerk away, and the body fell behind the counter. Taking his time, Zhang Ping walked around the counter, picked up the telephone. He dialed a number he had memorized 6 months ago. The call went through. Ringing. Once. Twice. A male voice answered. This was an unsecure line, yet Zhang threw caution to the wind. He had to know what was happening. The empty streets, the cell phones that didn't work, Choi's disappearance, the massive traffic jams on the exit roads. In about a minute he had it all. The news was out. The rumor that there was a Chinese nuke hidden at the naval base had emptied the town. Mass panic. The authorities were searching.
"Do you have any instructions?"
Zhang asked. No. That meant that the man had heard nothing from Beijing. Zhang stood beside his vehicle in the empty parking lot, listening to helicopters fly overhead, the low moan of jet engines. Stood listening and thinking. If Choi Li hadn't betrayed him yet, he soon would. That was problem number 1. Zhang decided to take care of it first. He climbed back into his stolen ride, started the motor, and headed for the Chan's restaurant. The lights in the parking lot were still on. Choi's SUV was sitting in front, nose into the building, the only vehicle in the lot. Not another car sat in the parking lots of the other storefronts to his right and left. Sally's old Toyota must be parked behind the building. Zhang saw the plywood over the window and the closed sign in the front door, which was undoubtedly locked. If Choi had called the authorities, this lot would be full of police and government cars. It wasn't, so he hadn't. Perhaps there was still time. When Choi Li got to the restaurant, the door was locked. He pounded on it until Sally opened it. Of all the things he had to say, the only thing he could think of was, "What happened to your window?" "Someone threw a brick through it." She locked the door behind him and headed for the bar. He trailed along. "Want a drink?" she asked. "A beer." When he had it, he sat down on a stool. The television was on. Sally sat on one at the end of the bar with her gin and tonic. "Want to tell me about it?" she asked. He stared at the video, and at the little ribbons with headlines running across the bottom. "Talk, or take your beer and get out," Sally said. "I'm a spy," he managed. "I thought you might be." "Honest to God, I don't know a damn thing about any nuclear weapons. I don't even know if there is one. 1, 2, or 3, or whatever. I've been watching the harbor, reporting on Navy ship movements since I got here. That's all I did." "And Zhang?" "I don't know about him. I thought he was a watcher too." "Maybe he's something else," she said, cool as a frosty morning. "Maybe." He thought about it. His head began to bob up and down. "Yeah, he probably is. I ran out on him while he was tying up the boat this evening. He's making me nervous. Don't you think you should call the FBI? Christ, Sally, let's you and me just get the hell out of here. How?
She gestured at the television, which was showing a sea of taillights on a highway somewhere. He sipped at the beer. It was cold and delicious. Sally hadn't touched her drink since he sat down.
You'll leave all these people here to get murdered by Zhang?
You don't know that he'd do that.
He smacked the bar with a palm.
Damn, woman, we don't know anything. And if I make that call, you and I won't be able to get out of here, have a life of our own.
Is that what you want?
Yes, I want to marry you. I'm in love with you, in case you haven't noticed.
The look on her face softened.
Lee, she said, if there is only one chance in 1,000 that there is a bomb hidden somewhere, we can't run. You have to call the FBI, and you have to tell them what you know. Help them find Zhang. Unless you do, there is no future for us.
There won't be one if I do.
She didn't say anything to that.
Why the hell do you think I haven't already called? I want a future for us.
Do it now. There's a phone right there on the podium by the door.
He turned to stare at it. He had seen Sally answer it 100 times, taking reservations. He looked back at her. She was watching him.
It still works, she said.
He walked over to it, picked up the receiver, and got a dial tone. Better call 911, he thought. He dialed it. Got only a busy signal. He was going to have to call the FBI, see if anyone was in the office.
Where's your phone book?
He asked. She got it from under the bar and brought it over. As Zhang approached the door to the restaurant, an old car with a bad muffler drove into the parking lot. The windows were down.
It's another fucking chink,
the driver said. White guy, young. Zhang heard the words but didn't understand them. He saw the shotgun barrel poking out of the rear window. He fell flat and rolled toward the front of his car as the shotgun boomed. The remaining window in the front of the restaurant dissolved into a cloud of glass fragments, most of which went into the place. Choi Lee and Sally fell on the floor as glass fragments sprayed the room. Sally stayed down, but Choi risked a look through the front door glass. He got a glimpse of Zhang and the dark car rolling slowly. Then the shotgun settled on the front door. He ducked as it went off and the glass flew into the restaurant.
It's Zhang,
he told Sally, then grabbed her and ran for the back door. Zhang Ping was shielded by his car and wouldn't have done anything if the old clunker hadn't stopped and the doors opened. 3 guys put their feet out. Only one had a gun. It was about 10 feet to the guy getting out holding the shotgun, a kid with long, sloppy hair. Zhang was on him before the boy could get the gun pointed, jerked it from his hand, and used the butt on his throat. The kid went down gurgling with a crushed larynx. He swung the gun onto the driver, another kid, and pulled the trigger. The driver's face instantly turned to a mass of blood as the shotgun boomed. The guy went over backward onto the asphalt. The other young man who had climbed from the car ran. Zhang pumped the gun to chamber another shell, pointed it at the fleeing man, then lowered it. He went over to the empty hole in the wall of the restaurant where the window had been and climbed through it. The lights were still on. No one in sight. He glanced behind the bar, then ran into the kitchen. The rear door was standing open. He paused to pull the shotgun slide back far enough to check that there was a shell in the chamber. He saw brass. He slammed the slide forward and charged out the door. Sally's Toyota was in the alley. Now the motor howled, the tires squalled, and it shot forward. Zhang Ping aimed at the driver's window and fired. Not enough lead. He missed. Got the rear passenger window. He jacked the slide and tried again. The gun clicked. Empty. He ran back through the restaurant with the shotgun in his hand, charged out the door, and ran over to the body of the punk who had gotten out of the clunker with it. The kid wasn't dead. He was turning blue and twitching. Had pimples. Maybe 18 or 19. Zhang patted him down, felt more shotgun shells in the kid's jeans. Helped himself. Got 5 of them, 12 gauge. Then he jumped into the driver's seat of his stolen car. Took the time to shove 3 shells into the gun's magazine, racked the slide to chamber around, and put the thing on the passenger seat behind him. In seconds, he had the engine running, checked that he would clear the clunker, and backed up. Ran over one of the bodies. He felt the bump and ignored it. Slammed the gear shift into drive and ran over the body again as he accelerated away down the street, in the direction the Toyota had taken down the alley.
"So what do you think, Lee?" Sally demanded. "Is Zhang just a watcher? Is there a bomb?"
"Put on your seatbelt," Choi shouted. He used his right hand to get his across his lap and latched, then turned right at the first street and stood on the accelerator. He was trying to figure out how to lose Zhang, who he knew to a certainty was coming after them. Choi didn't turn on his headlights. Maybe that would help. No traffic on the streets. They raced from the glow of one streetlight to another, running stop signs and red traffic lights. Sally brushed bits of safety glass from her hair. She had a few cuts on her face from the glass. Apparently none of the birdshot had entered the interior of the car, or if a few pellets had, they hadn't hit them. "The police station!" he roared at Sally over the howl of the motor. "Where is it?"
"I don't know,"
she replied. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw an SUV coming fast under the streetlights. No headlights either. He took the next left as fast as he dared. The tires squalled. The helicopter ride to the airport at Naval Base Norfolk took about an hour. From my window I could see interstates and highways due to the ribbon of headlights that filled them. Everyone was apparently going somewhere at 5 miles per hour, or less. Whatever illusions I had about the power of the internet these days, I lost on that ride. The ramp was littered with parked helicopters, at least a dozen, 2 civilian biz jets, some military ones. The sailor waiting when the chopper settled onto the ramp led me around all this aviation iron to the base operations building. We entered through the back door and climbed the steps to the main level, and got there just in time to watch through the front glass doors as a black limo pulled up and 4 men in civilian suits got out of it. A couple of high-ranking officers, they had a lot of gold braid on their sleeves, standing there shook hands and escorted them into the building. Chinese men. Probably the ambassador from the People's Republic, I figured, and some of his flunkies. I remembered learning sometime during the day that the ambassador was coming to prove that China had been maligned on the internet by evil Americans. They went along the hallway with the military brass and disappeared into an open door. The room was packed, I found out later, with every politician around, including the mayor of Norfolk and the governor of Virginia, plus assorted congressmen, senators, county officials, sheriffs, police chiefs, and folks from the State Department. No wonder the ramp looked like a used helicopter sales lot. My sailor led me upstairs and along a hallway to a conference room, which was packed with people huddled around a big table covered with satellite photos, maps, and drawings. Grafton was there, along with Admiral McKiernan, a captain or 3, a couple of commanders, some warrant officers, people I took to be senior non-coms, and a handful of civilians. There wasn't room for anyone else around the table. I stood against the wall and tried to make myself smaller. I gathered they were figuring out what sectors of the base and harbor had been searched, and planning what to search next. One of the captains was marking up a map with a magic marker. They left the room one by one, striding quickly. Finally, there was just Grafton and me left. He motioned me over, showed me the marked-up map. "What do you think?" he asked. "Why did you use 4 colors on this thing?" He explained the color code. Trust the military to use logic. This search was organized to the hilt. "Beats the hell out of me," I said, and dropped into a chair. Grafton fell into another, put his elbow on the table, and rested his chin in his hand as he scrutinized the map. "How come there are no colors out on Willoughby Spit?" I asked. "You going to search it?" "We are using all our assets to search the base and harbor. Already searched Craney Island, that Corps of Engineers dump across the river. We don't have anything left to do beyond the base perimeter." Maybe the Chinese figured that would be the case. "If it's in a house 3 miles from here," he mused, "the damage would still be the same." "How'd they plan it, you think?" "From a boat. He told me about the Ocean Holiday." "How heavy is it?" "Figure anything from 750 pounds to maybe 1,000. and so they didn't carry it through the streets to put it into someone's garage or basement. Unless they had a truck, probably not. Gotta have equipment to handle something that heavy, and they didn't climb the seawall carrying the thing and trot across the runway and stuff it into a hangar or down a storm drain. Grafton frowned and chewed his lower lip. I'd concentrate on the harbor bottom, I said. All the stuff the Navy uses to service ships and the waterfront, as far as I could search. We've already done that in the harbor, Grafton said. He picked up the handheld radio from the desk and called several people, issued orders. Instead of Area A, take your people to Willoughby Spit. Start at the tunnel entrance and work east along the waterfront. Get your divers into the water off the beach. He pulled some more people from another area and sent them south, up the Elizabeth River. When he had done that, I asked, how are they going to trigger this thing? That's what the experts have been working on. If the trigger is underwater, it is extremely doubtful if it's a radio signal device. Only the very longest wavelengths will penetrate water. Maybe it's got a clock that's ticking, I suggested. That option deprives the bomber of any control. Most military minds don't work that way. The guys giving the orders want to be able to change the target, or in this case the timing, right up to the last possible moment. No plan survives contact with the enemy. So how are they going to do it? I asked. Damned if I know, Jake Grafton admitted. I don't know anything about boats, I remarked. Neither do I, Grafton said. Never owned one. Never even spent an afternoon on one. But I've heard guys talking. I was saving boats for my old age. I couldn't resist. Maybe it's time. I don't think he heard me. He was scowling at the map, fingering the handheld radio. After a bit, Admiral McKiernan, another admiral, the CO of the base, and Captain Joe Child, the SEAL team commander, came back in to consult the charts and talk to Grafton. More aides and department heads followed. Someone brought coffee. The room got so hot, some junior man cranked the windows open. Grafton and the brass discussed depth finders and fish finders. Everyone put in his 2 cents. And then Grafton caught my eye, and the two of us escaped. The motor roared and the wind shrieked through the shot-up window as Choi Lee drove as fast as he dared through the boulevards and highways eastward toward Point Comfort and tried to think. Not a police car in sight. Zhang Ping had a shotgun. He was going to kill both Choi and Sally, so they couldn't tell the authorities what they knew. Every few seconds Choi looked in his mirrors. He was still back there, a bit closer perhaps. A fire station? No one there had weapons. A military base. The amphibious base at Little Creek was ahead on the left. A mile or two more perhaps. He jerked his ride into a hard left turn as fast as he dared. The tires squalled. Now right onto Route 60, a 4-lane. Past a couple of cars heading west. Pedal to the metal. The highway angled south and crossed a bridge over an inlet. There, the main gate. He slammed on the brakes to slow for the turn. No cars waiting to get in. The barrier was down. He rammed through it, right by a sentry, smashed the thing to splinters. Kept going, accelerating as he checked his mirror. The sentry came running from the booth. Choi hoped he had pushed the alarm, and stood in the road. He was still standing there when Zhang Ping swung his SUV into the lane and hit the man, sent him flying over the vehicle. A traffic circle loomed ahead. Choi was going too fast. Brakes full on, he went around the thing with all 4 wheels sliding, and he was heading back toward Zhang. He swerved the car left and sideswiped Zhang. Glimpsed Zhang at the wheel at the instant of collision. Fighting the wheel, trying to go straight. But it was over in a flash, and Choi's steed was going off the road toward the right. Jumped the curb, now going sideways into a tree. Smashed into it on the right side. The engine was still howling, but they were going nowhere. Choi flipped off the ignition as he roared at Sally, who was dazed from the impact. Out! 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 Both right doors were jammed, as was the driver's door. Sally's door was against the tree. Both rear windows were gone. Choi managed to get Sally out of her seatbelt and climbed over the middle to the back. Then he grabbed her and pulled. "Wake up, goddammit! Wake up and help or die!" He risked a glance to his left. That asshole Zhang was walking across the street with the shotgun in his hands. Pulling with superhuman strength, Choi got Sally into the rear seat and shoved her head first through the right rear window opening. She was coming out of her daze and wriggling, trying to help maybe. Choi was pushing her legs through the opening when Zhang shot him in the back from a distance of 8 feet. Choi Lee collapsed. He didn't hear the siren or see the Navy pickup with flashing lights mounted on the cab screech to a halt in the street. The driver bailed out and used the truck bed wall for a rest, both arms on it with pistol in hand. "Drop the damn gun!" the sailor shouted as he tried to align the pistol's sights. He was aiming it when Zhang got off the first shot. The bird shot struck the sailor in the upper half of his face, putting out both eyes. The man fell backward to the pavement. Zhang glanced again at Choi, who lay with his face against the right rear door of the Toyota. The shot charge had hit him between the shoulder blades. Zhang walked, not ran, across the street to the stolen SUV, reached in and grabbed the iPad. The shotgun was in his right hand, pointing as he approached the pickup, which was still running, with lights flashing and siren moaning. The wounded sailor writhed on the street with his hands on his face. Lots of blood. Near him lay his pistol. Zhang picked it up and stuffed it into his waistband. Zhang Ping got behind the wheel of the Navy truck, tossed the iPad on the passenger seat, and put the vehicle in gear. In 15 seconds, he was out the gate and heading west on the empty highway. Only then did he fiddle with the switches on the dash and kill the siren and flashing lights. It was 2 a.m. in Norfolk when the paramount leader and his lieutenants met with Admiral Wu and the other members of the Central Military Commission at the August 1st building in Beijing. It was 2 p.m. there. Lots of military brass were also in attendance. When Admiral Wu got a look at the faces, his misgivings grew exponentially. The Internet storm in America cast a serious cloud. Millions of American fingers were already being pointed at China. In the cold light of day, the planned propaganda offensive that would cast the blame for a nuclear explosion at the Norfolk naval base on the American Navy looked less and less likely to deflect the inevitable flood of outrage after the blast. "We are going to light a candle in a hurricane," the paramount leader remarked, which set the tone for the meeting. Someone else remarked that the Internet poison from America was already seeping into China, despite the censor's best efforts. American outrage was one thing, but Chinese outrage threatened the party's control here. Control of the people of China was the one thing on this earth the people in this room could not afford to lose. Admiral Wu argued that America could not go to war with China. Wu understood politics within the military and in Beijing, and he well knew he was betting his career right here, in this meeting. Yet, as he explained, this was China's best chance to change the balance of power in the Western Pacific, tilted in favor of China and her future. The American administration was arguing that the Internet rumors were just that, rumors without substance. "If the American Navy believed there was a threat, they would order their ships to go elsewhere, but they have not," he said. 2 carriers are there, and 3 carriers more are still planning on tying up in Norfolk, 1 in about 10 hours, and 2 in a few days. But after the bomb explodes and the base and ships are destroyed, the American administration will face a tsunami of public opprobrium, one of the PLA's senior generals argued. Caution and realpolitik considerations will be washed away in the demand to do something. The Americans will not declare war, Admiral Wu stated flatly. They don't have to go that far, was the riposte. An embargo of all imports from or exports to China will damage our economy severely. If the Americans can get Japan, Australia, and the European Union to go along, several 100 million people will immediately be out of work. Can our economy withstand such a blow? If we don't explode the weapon, they will eventually find it. That is inevitable. We can deny it as ours, someone shot back. Since no damage was done, they can swallow the denial whole, and probably will. The paramount leader made the decision. He didn't announce it. He merely looked at Admiral Wu and said, "Contact our agent and tell him not to explode the weapon. Tell him to leave the country as quickly as he can." Blood drained from Wu's face. He said, "Sir, we have a problem.
We have been trying to contact the agent for almost 18 hours, and cannot. The cell phone network in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area is off the air. Neither telephone calls nor emails can be delivered wirelessly. He called his contact via landline several hours ago, but the contact had no instructions for him. Unless and until he calls again, he is not under our control.
Chapter 24. When they get in trouble, they send for the sons of bitches. Ernest J. King. Before he went to the marina, Zhang Ping stopped by his apartment and packed a backpack with food, water, and a couple of packs of cigarettes. Then he turned off the lights for what he knew would probably be the last time, and made sure the door was locked behind him. Waiting for the carrier due to arrive later today would be about all the risk that could be justified, he thought, given that Sally Chan would probably tell everything she knew. He should have shot her, too. Another mistake. The carrier due on the 20th, the day after tomorrow, and the one coming in on the 22nd, 2 days later, were out of the question. Yet, he mused, what did Sally Chan know? Whatever Choi told her, but what was that? Choi knew nothing of the bomb, nothing of the ship's schedules, nothing of the triggering device. True, he had seen the iPad hooked up to the boat's radar, but he hadn't said a word about it to Zhang. Could he have figured out what he was seeing? Zhang didn't think so. The truth was, he didn't want to think so. This mission was going to cost him his life, and he wanted it to be worth his sacrifice. 3 of those humongous aircraft carriers, 95,000 tons each, their air wings, their escorts, 3 complete battle groups. That would be a triumph indeed. Not a victory on the magnitude of 5 battle groups, but he never expected to get all 5. That was just a goal. Like every other goal, merely a target to aim at. It might be achievable in a perfect world, if the stars aligned and the enemy behaved just as he wished and nothing went wrong. However, perfection was rare in human affairs, Zhang knew. He had never expected to sail through without problems. Bagging 3 battle groups was a more realistic goal, one that would be a severe blow to America. He would be happy with that. The Navy corpsman who took Sally Chan to the emergency room at the Little Creek dispensary tried to question her, but she had a concussion. The collision with the tree had bounced her head off the passenger's window. As she lay in the hospital, her memories were jumbled. The brick through the window, Choi Lee, what he had said about Zhang, about watching Navy ships, the shots, the chase, the crash. It was all jumbled up. She babbled to the nurses, the doctor, and the lieutenant commander in charge of base security gathered around her bed. In truth, even if she had been coherent, it wouldn't have mattered. The bodies lying in the parking lot at the Chan's restaurant had been discovered by people driving by, but landline calls to 911 went unanswered. Even if a dispatcher could have been reached, all the police on the Norfolk, Virginia Beach Peninsula were out on the highways trying to salvage an impossible situation and save lives. Anarchy reigned. There had been at least 5 fatal accidents so far, another 10 or 12 with injuries. Medevac helicopters were trying to get injured victims to hospitals in time to save their lives. People were driving like maniacs, jumping medians, running along the berms and trying to cut back into line, going against traffic on divided highways, basically driving without a lick of sense. How many fender benders there were, no one knew. Blood was flowing. Casualties were trapped in wreckage. There were no police available to investigate shootings in suburban mall parking lots, no one to put the pieces together, no one whatsoever to check out suspicious characters at local marinas. Consequently, Zhang Ping had no trouble getting the covers off the Boston whaler, no trouble getting his backpack and iPad aboard, no trouble releasing the lines and getting the Mercury outboards rumbling. He advanced the throttles slowly and eased out of his slip, went down the channel between the slips at idle, then finally cruised slowly along the channel toward Chesapeake Bay without seeing another boat. The night was his. And a fine night it was, with an overcast that made the moon gauzy. No wind, temp in the low 50s. By 11:30 in the evening he was in the bay and shoved the throttles a bit forward. Well away from the marina, he put the boat on autopilot and hooked up the iPad, The carrier due in late tomorrow was supposed to dock at 1 in the afternoon. That meant it would clear Cape Henry sometime in mid-morning, perhaps about 9 or 10. It would be within the blast area by then, any time after 9 or 10. The trigger had a timer on it. Zhang could set a delay on it by simply programming it into the iPad, up to 24 hours. His fingers hovered over the iPad keyboard. He didn't know if the carrier was going to be on time, nor did he know if the accompanying ships were going to enter with the carrier or be strung out for hours awaiting tugs to get them into their berths. Nor did he know if the trigger would accept a time delay or merely detonate when the capacitors were fully charged, which took about 30 seconds. He set the delay for 14 hours. Zhang fingered the autopilot, turned it off, and advanced the throttles. He examined the GPS display. He was 2 miles out into the bay. With the radar going and the scope adjusted, he turned westward, toward the channel that led over the Hampton Roads tunnel. It was 7 miles away. He looked for the radar reflectors that marked either side of the channel. There they were, blossoming on the scope as dots of bright light when the sweeping radar signal illuminated them. They caught the radar beams, concentrated them, and reflected them back. Zhang took a deep breath, then pushed an icon on the screen of the iPad. That would encode the radar signal being transmitted toward the reflectors. The one on the left, to the north of Old Fort Wool, where the tunnel dived under Hampton Roads. The one that had a wire leading to the bomb's trigger. He waited for 10 seconds or so, then saw the message sent icon. Zhang looked at his watch. 11:53 a.m. Unless he sent an immediate detonation message in the interim, the bomb would explode at 15:53 this afternoon. The battle group should be at the pier or in the estuary by then. 3 battle groups. A good haul, unless it exploded within the next few seconds. Dying would be ridiculously simple. When it came, there wouldn't be time for a single sensation. Not light, heat, or concussion, sound, none of that, to register on his brain before he was vaporized and his molecules consumed in the atomic furnace. He would feel nothing. In fact, he would not even know it happened, nor would any of the other people who were going to die with him in the heart of the detonation. All of them would simply cease to be. Those folks on the edge of the blast zone, however, were going to die hard. Zhang had never allowed himself to think about them. Zhang Ping waited, and waited, and waited. He turned his boat to the north and shoved the throttles forward to the stops. The boat came up on the plain. Try to catch me now, he thought. Too late. Too late for you. He was abeam the Grandview fishing pier in Hampton when he noticed the moon was gone. The overcast had thickened, and the temperature was dropping. Off Marsh Point, rain began smearing the windshield. He turned on the wipers. The night was devoid of light. A few lights on boats and flashing lights from lighthouses were all that enlivened the gloom. The cockpit of the whaler was illuminated dimly by eyebrow and instrument lights, and by the glow of the radar repeater and iPad screen. He adjusted the brightness of all of these. Zhang steered into the mouth of the York River and started it up. When he had been assigned this mission by Admiral Wu, he and the Admiral had discussed the fact that he would have to perish in the blast. After the weapon detonated, there he would be, a lone Chinese man without an escape plan in a country whose language he didn't speak or read. He would be captured quickly and interrogated. The best that could happen was that he would spend the rest of his life in a cell. Now, with the trigger activated, the thought of running north up the bay as far as he could get in 12 hours crossed his mind. But he dismissed the thought. Lights along the banks of the river from houses. This was the town of Pocosin. He button-hooked around the point and, using the radar, found a creek or inlet on the west side of Plumtree Island National Wildlife Refuge. After checking his depth finder to ensure he had enough water under the keel, he put the engines in idle and went forward, released the anchor. He backed down a bit, letting chain out, then killed the engine. The rain increased. Held by the anchor chain, the boat rocked ever so gently, no doubt as artifacts of the swells that entered the bay from the ocean dissipated themselves in this placid backwater. All the lights were gone now. Fog. He could feel it on his cheeks. The metal bits and plastic panels of the cockpit became wet to the touch. He checked the pistol he had taken from the sailor at Little Creek, a Beretta M9, 9mm, 14 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. He made sure the safety was on and stuck it behind his belt. The shotgun he laid across the empty passenger seat. His cell phone had a nice charge on it. No service, of course. He plugged it in to charge anyway. Zhang got a fresh pack of cigarettes from his backpack, opened it and lit one, smoked it slowly, savoring the smoke. Dawn was oozing into the fog when Zhang Ping settled down to drink a bottle of water, eat some boiled eggs, and listen to the rain patter steadily on the little roof over the cockpit. The thought that this was his last morning on Earth never occurred to him. He felt fully alive, in control, his mission essentially completed, successfully. A man can't ask for more than that from life. He snuggled deeper into his jacket, sighed contentedly, and lit another cigarette. The truth was, he was tired. When he finished the cigarette, he flipped the butt into the water. He checked to ensure the anchor was holding. It was. He took the shotgun and went below, where he lay down on one of the bunks. Sleep came quickly. Grafton bought my breakfast at the base cafeteria. Our badges dangling around our necks got us in, and we scooped scrambled eggs, bacon, sausage, potatoes, biscuits, and gravy onto plastic trays. Normally I don't eat a lot of carbs and fat, but I had the sneaking premonition this might be my last meal, so what the hell? I figured my robe in the angel choir would cover my tummy bulge. Apparently a lot of other people felt the same way. The place was packed with sailors, Marines and civilians, men and women, and they were loading their trays. After putting mine on a table, I went back for 2 cups of coffee. Grafton said little, just forked food. The pile on his tray was more modest than mine. Maybe he planned on being alive tomorrow. If he was, I wanted to know how he hoped to pull off that feat. I asked, but he wasn't telling. He had a do-not-disturb look on his face. I was tired of him and tired of the suspense. After scattering Anna's ashes, I've been thinking about cremation, but I was hoping to put it off for a few more years, I told him. Grafton was ignoring me. Outside, I could see the fog turning gray. Dawn. Oh, boy. I pushed my tray back when I had eaten all the grub I wanted, which was only about half of what I had taken. My stomach didn't feel right. Maybe I was going to upchuck. I was ready for a last cigarette and a blindfold. I hadn't had a cigarette since the 10th grade. Didn't like that one way back then. However, the world had turned, not for the better, and now I was ready to give cancer a chance. About that time, Grafton's radio squawked to life. He listened a bit. I couldn't make sense of the words. He stood and motioned to me. Outside, he said, "They've got a dead guy who looks like he's Chinese over at Little Creek. Woman who looks the same way, alive with a concussion. They drove through the gate and somebody shot the guy and one of the sentries. McKiernan is sending a car. He wants me to go look." We certainly weren't going to fly over there. The fog was so thick you could have sliced it and spread it on toast. I'd never seen anything like it. With lights and siren going, the driver still took 45 minutes to make the trip in a gray Navy van. At the Little Creek dispensary, Grafton was taken in to see a woman who said her name was Sally Chan. I trailed along. She spoke English as well as I did, maybe better. She was distraught over the death of the Chinese man who she said was named Choi Lee. The doctor whispered to me that Choi had been shot in the back. Miss Chan talked for 2 or 3 minutes, then answered a half-dozen questions. Chinese spies, Zhang Ping, a boat. Grafton got busy talking into his radio. I went outside, puked up my breakfast in the grass. I was standing there by the van trying to get my stomach to stop doing flips, when the sailor who had driven us, a petty officer, lit a cigarette. I bummed one. He lit it for me. The sailor wanted to talk. "Boy, these internet rumors are a real laugh, aren't they?" "Oh, you bet," I agreed and puffed on my bummed weed. "A nuke at the naval base. What a fucking crock. I can't figure out how shit like that gets taken seriously." "Oh, you know," I muttered. The cigarette was making me a little lightheaded. While he yammered on about rumors and crap on the net, I finished the cigarette right down to the filter and tossed it out onto the asphalt. The fog was the color of wet concrete and almost the same consistency. Another car pulled up, and Sal Molina got out. He had a little radio, too. He looked at me and asked, "Where is he?" "Inside." Molina disappeared through the door. "Miss Chan, this is Sal Molina. He's an aide to the president." Sally Chan wasn't impressed.
"What president?"
"Of the United States."
"That plays golf all the time? That asshole?"
"Yup," Molina said. "That one."
"Oh."
She looked at Grafton.
"And who are you again?"
"I'm Jake Grafton, interim director of the CIA." Sally Chan was trying to control her tears. They had told her Choi Lee was dead, and she was trying to handle that and listen to these people, what they had to say.
"Your people have been doing a really shitty job,"
Sally Chan said, and burst into tears. My mouth tasted like an ashtray smelled. At least it didn't taste of vomit. The sailor was still running his mouth when the Admiral and Molina came out of the dispensary 10 minutes later. Grafton motioned to us to mount up. I climbed in the back of the van with Molina, and Grafton climbed in beside the sailor. He was talking on his radio. "Cart, the shootout occurred a little after 2 o'clock this morning." He glanced at his watch. 5 hours ago. Chinese guy named Zhang, doesn't speak English. He worked with a guy who was apparently Chinese-American, guy named Choi Lee. Choi is dead, shot by Zhang. Sally Chan said Zhang bought a boat a while back, 4 or 6 weeks ago, a Boston whaler. Zhang and Choi like to go fishing. Fished all day, 4 or 5 days a week, weather permitting, almost every week. Unintelligible babble came from the radio. Jake Grafton motioned for the sailor to roll the van as he considered. "I think at this point he's probably got a clock ticking on the weapon. A shootout, an abandoned vehicle with a body in it, a dead sailor. This Zhang isn't worried about being caught and prosecuted." More babble. "Soon. Probably when that carrier comes into the bay. Lincoln." The sailor was staring at Grafton with his mouth open. The van was sort of on its own. Grafton noticed, let go of the transmit button, and said to him, "Drive the van, sailor." After a few more back-and-forth transmissions, Grafton put the radio in his lap and turned around to face me. "They'll get some choppers and jets searching for this boat when the fog lifts in a few hours. I doubt if they'll find it. He's long gone. Probably triggered the thing and boogied. Guess we better find the weapon, huh?" "Yeah," Grafton said to me. To the driver he said, "Let's drive on the beach, from the edge of the naval reservation here at Little Creek westward." "That's illegal, sir." The kid had more juice in him than I thought. Of course, exploding a nuclear weapon was also illegal, but I kept that remark to myself. "Just do it, son," Grafton told him. Grafton got back on the radio, called for a boat to pick us up off the beach. Looking back on it, I think he probably knew then how the bomb had been triggered and where it might be. Of course, he never made a comment to that effect. Not Jake Grafton. I glanced at Molina to see how he was taking all this. He was looking out the window beside him, apparently paying no attention. That pissed me off a little. He didn't look to me like he was thinking about all the people who were going to die if the bomb went off. Him, me, the winos asleep in the gutters, women, kids, illegals, everyone. All of us. I wanted to slap him. I wanted everyone to get as worried as I was. I wanted to scream. That's when Molina told Grafton, "The National Security Council decided to turn the cell phones back on here in southeastern Virginia." Grafton turned his head to stare. "It's political pressure, Jake," Molina added. "The governor and Congress people are getting crucified." The Admiral didn't say another word to Molina. Got busy telling the sailor driving the van where to go. I sat there sympathizing with those unhappy voters, who weren't going to be political problems anymore if they were dead. The boat that picked us up on the beach was a Coast Guard boat. It loomed out of the fog like a ghost. I didn't realize it was there, then it materialized. It had a red inflatable rail around it, a little square white cabin in the middle, and a machine gun mounted on a swivel on a post on the bow. They put it almost up on the beach, but not quite, so Grafton and I had to wade out to the thing and climb over the rail. The guy who helped us aboard was going to be the commandant someday, He said, "Hello, Admiral," to Grafton and ignored me and Molina. I was wet from the knees down and in an unpleasant mood. Perhaps the fact that I knew we were all going to hell together in very short order had something to do with it. A man ought to be able to pick those he dies with. I had these damn stumble-bums and Jake Grafton. Grafton and Molina went into the little wheelhouse, and I went forward to where the gunner was sitting on a tiny stool beside his machine gun, which looked like an M60 and had a belt in the breech. The sight of that gun made me feel better. We were ready to kill somebody, sure as shooting. I glanced at the gunner, who looked maybe 19. He had on an orange life vest. "Put on a life vest, buddy," the gunner said. "They're inside." "No, I'm not going swimming." "I said put on a fucking life vest, asshole," the gunner snarled, "or I'll personally throw you over the side." Everyone was having a bad morning. I heard the motor throttle down. We drifted up to a thing that stuck out of the water on a wooden piling or post, and had some kind of three-dimensional triangular thing on the top of it. The motors of the boat reversed, and we stopped dead right beside it. Jake Grafton came out for a look. He had on an orange vest, too. The thing on top of the pole had 4 triangular pieces of metal welded together into a pyramid, which was turned on its side with the open end facing east. Another similar pyramid faced west, and one north. Nothing to the south. Jake Grafton inspected the thing, then made a motion to the helmsman on the other side of the glass, inside the little superstructure. "What the hell is that?" I asked him. "Radar reflector," he said. "They mark the channels. Radar waves are reflected back to the emitter, and the reflector appears on a scope as a bright blip." He went back inside. I tried to find a place to sit. Finally, I sat on the inflatable edge of the boat. The water was pretty flat, so it was unlikely I'd fall in. 5 minutes later, we were stopped at another radar reflector. Grafton examined it and waved the helmsman on. The fog was getting thinner. The day was moving right along. I looked at my watch. 9 minutes before 9 o'clock. We went westward along the beach, doing all the radar reflectors. They marked obstacles, entrances to channels that went into estuaries where the developers had been busy, fishing piers, etc. What he was looking for I didn't know, nor was I curious. I was waiting for the big click. I wasn't going to hear a bang, just maybe a little click, and I would find myself standing in an anteroom someplace with a whole horde of other folks, waiting for my turn to go up to St. Pete at the podium and go over the list of my sins. I actually had a pretty good list. I'd been a busy boy since I went through puberty. I didn't know if I'd get into heaven, but in my favor was the fact that I bought Girl Scout cookies every year since I got out of law school. I hoped that was in old Pete's computer. Sins shriek and virtues whisper. He was more likely to know about the former than the latter. Preachers never talk about how great their congregations are. Nope. They talk about what sinners they are. It's the human condition. Religion, anyway. The fog was lifting. Visibility was up to at least a mile. We could see the radar reflectors on their pilings from a good ways off. Now the coxswain merely slowed, and Jake Grafton stood beside the wheelhouse and looked at the reflector as we went slowly by. Then the coxswain poured the juice to the motors, and we roared down to the next one. I tried to remember any other virtues I might have. Something to tell St. Pete. $1 or $2 here and there given to charity. A beer for an alky. Couldn't remember a single old lady I'd ever helped across the street. Virtues, virtues. I knew I was light in the virtues department. But since I normally didn't think about stuff like this, I didn't realize how desperate the situation was. Truth is, my mom could have done with a better son. Zhang Ping was awakened from a sound sleep by the ringing of his cell phone. He heard the noise, had to look around for a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, until he knew where he was and what he was hearing. He rolled out, dashed up the stairs to the cockpit, picked up the phone and looked at it. 47 missed calls. The phone was ringing now, though. He turned it on and made a noise, more like a grunt. The fog was lifting a little bit. Several hundred yards visibility here. No wind. A male voice speaking Chinese said, "Commander Zhang." "Yes." "This is Neptune." Zhang recognized Admiral Wu's voice. "This is an unsecure line."
I am aware of that. The decision has been made to abort the mission. I repeat, abort the mission."
Zhang Ping took a very deep breath and exhaled completely before he said,
"Code Purple."
That meant the device was armed.
"I repeat, Code Purple."
The Admiral didn't hesitate.
"Turn it green," he said. "Green. Acknowledge."
Green meant safety the device.
"I can only try, sir. No promises."
"Yes." The connection broke. Zhang Ping held the phone in his hand a while. Looking at the houses and little boat docks he could see in the diffused sunlight coming from an uncertain overcast sky. Beijing had chickened out. They had decided not to detonate the device. They had the right to make that decision, Zhang told himself. After all, it was their bomb, and if it went off, they were going to have to live with the consequences. He glanced at his watch. 9:37. Well, he had plenty of time. God, what a waste. All the blood and angst, and Beijing chickened out. Maybe he should just ignore Beijing and let the bomb explode. After all, what were they going to do? Court-martial him? He would be dead. But no, he couldn't do that. He was an officer in the plan. Obey or die trying. Zhang Ping got busy. He started the outboard motors, inched forward, put the motors in idle. Then he walked forward along the bow and raised the anchor, pinned it in its bracket. It was muddy, but so what? Once in the cockpit, he backed the boat into the middle of the little estuary, stopped all motion and let the boat drift a bit as he fired up the iPad and connected it to the radar. He was going to go out into the York, go east and run down the bay toward the naval base, get the radar reflector on the scope, cancel the detonation order. Then what? Get out of the country, Admiral Wu said. Right. As if bodies lying all over weren't going to get the Americans in a tizzy. Zhang went below for a piss and the shotgun, checked that the pistol was stuck in his belt, got into the seat behind the wheel. The engines were idling, the props motionless. The Americans had had all morning to hunt for the bomb. If they thought it was armed, they would pay little attention to him and his Boston whaler. But if they didn't know, the Hampton Roads area and Lower Bay would be heavily patrolled to keep strange craft out. As heavily patrolled as possible in this fog. He would have no chance to get close enough to disarm it. The truth was that he would probably be dead in a couple of hours, whether the bomb detonated or not. Then none of this would matter. Those idiots in Beijing whose courage leaked out through their dicks could face the consequences. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the visibility was 2 or 3 miles, I estimated, when we reached the radar reflector on Old Fort Wool, the southernmost terminus of the Hampton Roads Tunnel. We cruised up to the radar reflector. Jake Grafton took a look and raised a closed fist. Stop. I went over for a look, saw a wire leading up the wooden post to the reflector, and some kind of little antenna sticking up in the middle of the pyramid that faced east, toward Fort Henry and the Atlantic. This is it, Grafton announced. The bastard looked happy. He leaned in the open door of the helmsman's domain, told him to anchor here, right here, then came back out on deck. Molina was right there holding on to a wire railing, looking like a tourist in a whorehouse. Got a knife, Tommy? Nope. He turned to the nearest sailor. Got a knife? The sailor produced one, a folding knife with a 3-inch blade that looked as if it had been made in China. Grafton handed it to me. You do the honors. Cut the wire that runs down the pole. I stood on the inflatable gunwale, then grabbed the pole, as the boat seemed to move away, and started sawing on that wire. Got the insulation off, but the wire looked like copper. Terrific. The knife wasn't very sharp either. I got a grip on one of the reflector's braces with my left hand, wrapped my legs around the pole, and sawed away on the wire with my right hand while trying not to fall into the water. If I did, I wouldn't drown, because I was wearing my orange life vest. I heard Grafton on the radio calling for SEALs. Just about the time I got the wire sawed in half, he shouted, 10 minutes! They'll be here in 10 minutes! The coastie coxswain maneuvered the red inflatable rail back under me, so I stepped down on it and let go of the reflector. I handed the sailor back his knife. I flopped down beside the machine gun. Maybe we were going to live a bit longer. I tried to analyze how I felt. Damn, I didn't know. It wasn't even 10 minutes, maybe 8, when an inflatable boat roared up containing a couple of guys in wetsuits. They had scuba tanks on their backs and flippers on their feet. They put the mouthpieces where they were supposed to go, jumped into the water right by the pole, and went straight down. The coxswain moved the boat so they wouldn't surface under it. I was glad that I wasn't a SEAL. I surveyed the fog bank, now maybe a couple miles away. I could just make out the Hampton end of the tunnel, Newport News. Helicopters were hopping up and down from Chambers Field on base. I could see the 2 carriers lying beside their piers, and of course the stop-and-go traffic trying to get into the tunnel. In a moment the SEALs came up, 2 of them holding a device about the size of a laptop, flippering to keep themselves on the surface. They passed it to Grafton. "It's the trigger," Grafton said, giving it a good look over with his glasses in place. The divers had cut the wires. SEALs carry serious knives. Grafton motioned to the SEALs. "Down. Find the bomb." Grafton handed the thing to me. It was waterproof and heavy, at least 10 pounds, because it contained batteries and no doubt a capacitor. I tried to pass it to Sal Molina, who looked but refused to touch. I gave the thing back to Grafton, who looked as if he were going to get it mounted to display in his office or den. So we were all going to live after all, if there was only one weapon. The divers came back up, and hanging onto the side of the boat, shouted at Jake Grafton. "The bomb is there. A few rocks had been shoved over it, but when we moved them, there it was." "What do you need to raise it?" "Some kind of harbor crane." The Admiral got on the radio. I flaked out by the gunner and gave him an expansive smile. Oh, baby, we were going to live at least until dinner, unless there was another bomb. Yet I knew, there was only one. 2 doubled the chances that one would be discovered. 2 were at least twice as hard to plant, and 2 wouldn't do any more damage than 1. After all, a nuke? How big do you want the smoking radioactive hole to be? So, after cogitation, I convinced myself there was only one bomb. And by God, here it was with the fuse pulled. Ain't life terrific? Grafton might have been with me on this. Maybe. But he sent coasties in boats hither and yon to inspect radar reflectors. He got the Navy involved, and before long, patrol and harbor boats were looking on the eastern shore and Hampton and Newport News, and up the James and Elizabeth rivers. When he finished with his radio, he had the coasties put us ashore on the nearest rock, the breakwater of old Fort Wool, and go off to examine the reflectors in the Navy Yard. The coasties willingly marooned the 3 of us, Grafton, Molina, and me, 2 over-the-hill paper pushers and 1 young stud looking for an action movie. I gave the gunner his life vest back, shook his hand, and sent him on his merry way. I felt so good that I actually sat on that wet, greasy rock and leaned back and studied the sky. The clouds, the water, boats and stuff. This being alive was pretty damned great. I didn't get a chance to talk to Grafton. He was more or less continuously on the radio. Molina ignored me. He took out his phone a time or 2, and apparently the last time found he had service. He climbed precariously across rocks until he was well out of my hearing, then dialed. Someone somewhere was apparently willing to talk to him, because I saw his lips moving. Maybe he was just saying the rosary or reciting poetry. I didn't know and I didn't care. I got out my cell phone. It logged right on to the net. So they had turned it on again. I put in a call to Sarah Houston. She answered it almost immediately. "Hey, kiddo, it's me. We found the damn thing."
"Oh, thank God,"
she exclaimed, and I had to agree. The fog was lifting somewhat as Lieutenant Commander Zhang Ping came south down the bay with the city of Hampton off to his right. He was passing Buckrow Beach when he saw a Coast Guard patrol boat come out of the fog heading northward. Zhang cut his speed to a few knots, well off the plain. He watched the patrol boat approach. It had a machine gun on a swivel mount in the bow, manned. Another man on the fantail, now walking up the port side by the little wheelhouse. 3rd man at the wheel. The boat slowed, and the man amidships shouted something. Zhang waved his arms. The patrol boat slowed and came alongside. Zhang pulled the Beretta from under his jacket and shot the man on the bow first. The man amidships second. Now the helmsman right through the glass. 3 shots for the helmsman. The engine of the patrol boat was at idle. Zhang Ping turned his boat, put it alongside, idled the engines, and scrambled aboard carrying the iPad. The whaler drifted away. He made sure each man was dead, then checked the machine gun. It had a belt in the breech. He pulled the bolt back and let it go home, chambering around. Engaged the safety. Then he went into the wheelhouse and added a bit of throttle. Turned the boat slowly to a southerly heading and removed his iPad from its case. Got out the wires. Looked at the radar presentation. Everything was different from the Boston whaler. He was going to have to find the radar equipment and trace out the wiring to install the iPad. No time for that now. He added throttle and checked the radar presentation. Willoughby Spit was quite plain, as was Fort Wool, 5 miles ahead. The reflector at Fort Wool beaconed brightly on the screen. Too brightly. Zhang realized something was wrong, but what? He had gone no more than a mile when the fog disappeared completely, as if a curtain had risen. He glanced behind him and saw gauzy gray. He had cleared the fog bank. And he could see everything. The carriers at the naval base, Willoughby Spit, the apartment and condo complexes, the shoreline eastward, and heading this way, another aircraft carrier. She had 2 destroyers in front of her and at least 1 behind, offset a little to the left. What a fine sight they were, home from the sea. Now Zhang Ping looked at his watch. 30 minutes until detonation. He had timed it nicely. The carrier would be almost here by then. The other 2 would go, the shipyard at Newport News, the naval base, and all the ships there. Overhead were helicopters, charging along on unknowable errands. 2 jets up high, fighters. More patrol boats near the channel over the Hampton Roads tunnel. They seemed to be along the shoreline, moving slowly. He aimed for Fort Wool, saw that a tugboat and a barge with a crane were beside the post that held his radar reflector. All that metal was reflecting radar energy. So they had found the bomb. Now they were raising it. There would be no explosion. Zhang Ping passed Point Comfort on his right. He was only a mile or so from the tugboat and barge, so he eased the throttles back. The channel over the tunnel was empty. Grafton and Molina stood on the rocks watching the divers hooking the weapon up to cables dangling from the crane prior to raising it. As usual, Grafton was on his radio and Molina on his cell phone. Sitting there beside them, trying to eavesdrop on what Molina was telling the big boss in Washington, I saw the Coast Guard patrol boat coming from the north. It was exactly like the one we had ridden in a couple of hours ago, with red inflatable rails, a wheelhouse, and a machine gun mounted forward. Only there were no sailors visible. I got my Kimber 1911 from my shoulder holster and lay down in the gravel between the stones, rested the butt of the pistol on a handy rock, and watched the boat come. It was slowing. The patrol boat turned a little and drifted to a stop about 75 yards from me, perhaps 20 from the tug, 30 or so from the barge, pointed at the tug. No one on either boat paid any attention to it. A man came out of the wheelhouse and walked forward, reached for the handle of the machine gun with his right hand. That's when I shot him. The butt of the pistol was resting right on the rock. I had both hands on the grip and a perfect sight picture when I squeezed the trigger. He sank down on the deck of the boat. I kept the pistol steady, ready, in case he got up again and reached for that gun. Jake Grafton heard the shot and turned to me. "What happened?" "I shot a man on that patrol boat." "Why?" "He wasn't wearing a life vest." Chapter 25. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Sun Tzu. The president flew down to Norfolk that evening in Marine One, standing with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, the chief of naval operations, the governor of Virginia, and the mayor of Norfolk. He held a press conference with the facade of the Chambers Field Ops building as background. I was curious, so I watched some of it. First, he denounced the internet rumors and resulting panic that had poisoned the public, despite the government's statements that the rumors were groundless. That the rumors had a hard core of fact and the government was telling lies was not mentioned. He segued on to the bodies scattered around the southwestern Virginia area.
"Terrorists have been attempting a major coup," he said, "and we have thwarted them. I wish I could say more, but I do not wish to compromise ongoing investigations or preclude the successful prosecutions of those responsible."
There was more, of course. The message was that it was safe to come home. The governor and mayor got a little mic time, and they confined their remarks to that point. When it was over and the television lights were extinguished, I sat watching Grafton and Molina with their heads together, talking in low tones. Those two were a pair. If they swore it was Monday, I'd check the calendar before I believed them. Technicians had been busy all afternoon on the nuke's trigger. The thing was armed and ticking down, they concluded. The iPad on the Coast Guard patrol boat with Zhang Ping's fingerprints all over it had a program that coded a radar transmission. The radar reflector had acted as an antenna and had passed the coded signal via a wire to the trigger resting under the surface of the water near the weapon, which was essentially buried under loose stones so it couldn't be found with sonar or a quick visual scan from the surface, if the water was actually clear enough to see through. All in all, the weapon and setup were simple and deadly. After the press conference, Molina climbed aboard Marine One with the president, and they choppered off to Washington. Grafton came over and sat down beside me. I was working on a cup of coffee. "You ready for some dinner?" he asked. As nutty as it sounds, he got behind the wheel of a Navy sedan and away we went, through the main gate and out into the wilderness of Norfolk, all the way to the Chan's Chinese restaurant. The place was practically empty, with only 3 other couples dining tonight. Sally Chan was behind the counter. Grafton introduced me. She sat down with us. She didn't look well. It had been a long day, but she said she couldn't stay home. The empty rooms pressed in relentlessly. "Did you see the president's press conference?" Grafton asked. She nodded. "Obviously, you can say anything you want to the press," Grafton said. "But the fact is the government will call you a liar if you say anything that contradicts the president's version of things." Sally Chan just stared at Grafton.
"Our relations with China."
Grafton nodded.
"You people aren't just going to let them get away with all this, are you?"
she demanded hotly. "I don't run the government," Grafton replied, a bit evasively, I thought. "But I hope not."
"Are you really the interim director of the CIA?"
"Yes." As we ate dinner, Sally talked about Choi Lee.
"He thought of himself as an American, there toward the end," she said. "After he became suspicious of Zhang, he was so conflicted."
She chattered on, speaking directly to Jake Grafton, who looked like the father you wished you had had. Non-judgmental, understanding, a man you could talk to. He looked that way anyhow, and maybe he did understand people, with all their diverse emotions and motivations, strengths and weaknesses. Yet a harder man I have never met. I thought Choi Lee and Zhang Ping were lucky that they were already dead. Grafton gave Sally a hug as we were leaving. She hugged him back fiercely. Grafton stayed in Norfolk for a few more days, and I went home the following morning on one of the endless stream of helicopters that plied back and forth between Norfolk and Washington. Before I left, I saw Grafton talking to the CO of the base, Captain Butler Spears. After a few minutes, Grafton shook Spears' hand, then came over to wish me goodbye. "Thanks for pulling the trigger on Zhang," he said. "If you had waited a few more seconds, more people would have died." I didn't say anything to that. If I had shot a coastie, even Grafton couldn't have saved me. The safe course would have been to wait until the guy started squirting bullets. Maybe the truth was I no longer gave a damn about playing it safe. If that were true, I wasn't long for this world. "How was everything with Spears?" I asked, because I had to say something. "He's waiting for the shoe to fall. NSA is doing a study of the internet traffic that spilled the beans about the possible threat to the base and triggered the panic. They'll have the result in a couple of days. Someone started the rumor, and it won't be that difficult to track down that person." "It could be anybody," I suggested. "Oh, no. That was a very tightly held secret, and hot, smoldering. Someone found it too hot to hold. We'll find out who. See you back at Langley." We shook hands, and I climbed aboard the giant egg beater. When it lifted off, Grafton was already out of sight. Sarah Houston was in her office when I rapped on her door. She let me in, then sat back down and stared at me. "Did I forget your birthday?" I asked.
"I thought you were soon to be gone. Permanently gone. Now you are back. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with that."
"There's no way you rationally can," I admitted.
"I'm beginning to understand that."
"Want to go get some lunch?"
"Not today. Maybe tomorrow. Or the day after. Ask me then."
"Sure." I hit the road, closed the door behind me, stood in the hallway feeling like dog crap for a minute or so. Perhaps this was a good thing. The truth is, I was womaned out. Maybe celibacy would be good for me, at least for a while. Grafton's executive assistants, Anastasia Roberts and Max Hurley, were glad to see me. They were full of curiosity about what had actually happened in Norfolk, but since it was all classified to the hilt, they didn't ask. And I didn't tell them. We talked about holiday plans. I stirred through the stuff on my desk, decided I didn't want to deal with any of it, and gave myself a meritorious day off. That afternoon, Willie the Wire and I made the rounds of the used car lots. At the third one we visited, I fell in love with a 1974 Mercedes 450 SL, a hard-top, ragtop convertible, in a pale robin's egg blue. Willie was appalled. "That thing is already 40 years old, Tommy. Can't you drive something younger than you are?" "Hey, this baby only has 142,000 on it. It's just getting broken in." "That odometer has probably been around the world more times than a hooker on crack," Willie observed. When the paperwork was finished and signed, I dropped Willie at the lock shop and took my new ride out on the road. I was feeling perky, headed north toward Philadelphia. Didn't actually get into the city. Stopped at a truck stop on the edge of town and bought a postcard of the Liberty Bell. I took it into the little diner where the truck drivers eat and sat at a booth. Using block letters, I addressed the card to Cuthbert Gordon, Mom's boyfriend out there in California. I noodled my message for a while, then wrote, "Fish has the contract." It was doubtful, I thought, that Cuthbert knew of Fish's recent disability. I signed the card, "A Friend." That was a stretch because old Bertie probably never had any friends, but you never know. I bought a stamp, peeled the thing off its backing using my fingernails, and affixed it to the card. Then I rubbed the front and back of the card on my jeans to smear whatever prints were on there. After I mailed it, I hit the road back to Washington. I liked the way my new ride handled and resolved to trade cars every 10 years, whether I needed to or not. When Jake Grafton got back to Langley, he called Sal Molina. "We need to talk," he said. "McKiernan and I want to see the president." "Maybe you and I ought to visit first." "Yeah. Come over to my house this evening after dinner. We'll have a beer." "Okay." So Jake drove to Bethesda and said hello to Mrs. Molina and followed Sal to the basement. When they each had a cold beer in hand, Jake got to it. "We're going to have to do something that teaches the Chinese they can't screw with us." "Jesus, we're like the Mafia now." The Chinese decided to try to wipe out the Atlantic Fleet's capital ships. They saw an opportunity and leaped for it. The murders and the shoot-down of Air Force One were all diversions intended to keep our eyes off the ball, and it was going their way when for some reason Zhang decided, or was told, to trigger the bomb with only 3 carriers in port. Perhaps the internet storm panicked the people in Beijing. Molina nodded and sipped beer. "The question that we can't answer is why Zhang was returning to the radar reflector that he used to trigger the bomb." "Maybe he wanted to die." "He could have done that anywhere." After a bit, Molina said, "Okay, answer the riddle." "I think he was probably coming back to safety the thing. I think Beijing changed their minds." Sal Molina rubbed his forehead and eyes. "Got anything to substantiate that think?" "There is no other logical explanation. His superiors ordered him back. NSA has a recording of at least one Chinese-language conversation that took place on a cell network that could be the one. Zhang died 2.5 hours later." "Which gets us where?
Molina asked. We must convince them that we know that they did it. We know that they intended to kill a couple million Americans and cripple our Navy, even if they did change their minds at the last minute. And they had better never try something like this again. Not even think about it. How do you propose that we accomplish all that? Jake Grafton told him. In the days that followed the President's press conference and the arrival of the final 2 Atlantic Fleet carriers in Norfolk, the world got back to normal, more or less. Most of the people in southeastern Virginia went home. Christmas came and went. The politicians flanged up another deal to raise the federal debt ceiling, and in January 3 of the carriers and their battle groups sailed away. Captain Butler Spears' grandson arrived in the world in the usual manner, more or less on schedule. He and his wife Kat talked repeatedly by telephone in the evenings. Finally he asked her, "Did you send any emails telling your friends to evacuate Norfolk?" She denied it, of course, and he knew she was lying. He knew her. He didn't press it. The fact of the matter was that he had betrayed his trust by revealing classified information to her. He had. At the time, he thought he had a good reason, and no doubt he did. And so did every other single person who was entrusted with the secret. Most of them didn't reveal the secret, but he had. He wondered if the NSA investigation of the email trails would get back to his wife. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Regardless, the fact that he had betrayed his trust weighed heavily upon him. Numerous people, 20 at latest count, had died in car wrecks trying to get out of the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. He hadn't caused the car wrecks, yet still he wondered if in some small way he wasn't responsible. It could go either way, Spears thought. Someone, his boss probably, would call him in and say, "NSA traced it to your wife, Kat," or to Ellie or that dweeb Harold. "We're going to interrogate them under oath. Ask Kat if she got the information from you. Ask Ellie and Harold if they got it from you or Kat." On the other hand, the word would filter down that someone else was the leak. Either way, the bald fact was that he, Captain Butler Spears, commanding officer of Naval Base Norfolk, had leaked classified information to a person not authorized to have it. If the Chinese agent had been able to read English and had seen and heard the mass panic, he might have detonated the bomb then and there. It was a miracle he didn't. Regardless of who got blamed, Spears knew he had seen the ghost and failed. As a man and a naval officer. One evening, Butler Spears sat at home brooding over all this. He drank a Jack Daniels on the rocks, then went to the basement and found a good piece of rope that he'd used several years ago to tie up his small fishing boat. He stopped in the kitchen, poured one more drink, then went to the garage and got out his big stepladder. His wife's car was missing, of course, so there was plenty of room in there. He erected the stepladder, climbed up on it, and tied the rope to the highest beam he could find. He tied a noose in the rope and let it dangle. Butler Spears climbed back down and finished the drink as he eyed the height of the noose. He was going to have to keep his knees up. He put the glass on a little workbench he had against one wall. He climbed the ladder, put the noose around his neck with the knot under his left ear, took a deep breath, remembered his knees, and jumped. He had figured the drop just right. The noose snapped his neck like a dry twig, and he died instantly. Chapter 26. War is very simple, direct, and ruthless. It takes a simple, direct, and ruthless man to wage war. George S. Patton. In early January, Captain Joe Child was summoned to the Pentagon for a classified briefing. To Child's surprise, the briefing wasn't classified secret, but top secret. There were at least 6 admirals in attendance, and the CNO, Admiral Cart McKiernan. The interim DNI was there, along with Jake Grafton, the interim director of the CIA. They sat in the back of the conference room and didn't say a word. "Captain," the CNO said, "your mission is to sink a ship, the Chinese aircraft carrier Liaoning." The ship was, Child was told, the former Soviet carrier Varyag. After the breakup of the old Soviet Union, Ukraine inherited the Varyag, a ski-jump carrier of about 59,000 tons when fully loaded.
But money was impossible for the Ukrainian Navy to find, so she was stripped of engines and equipment, and the hulk was finally sold to a Chinese consortium from Macau that intended, they said, to turn her into a floating casino. That didn't happen, but the PLAN got hold of her and decided to rebuild her as a carrier. The briefer went into all of this at length, then got past the history lesson and discussed the plan's first aircraft carrier. She's operational now, with an air wing and a capability that is superior to anything in the Philippine or Vietnamese navies. "You want me to sink her?" Child said incredulously. "Yes." Joe Child turned to McKiernan, who was sitting off to one side. "Sir, may I ask why?" "You know about the nuke we found at Norfolk," McKiernan said. "We are going to try to convince the Chinese Navy that messing with us is a bad idea, and they'd better not do it again." 4 days later, Joe Child was in Pearl watching 2 high-speed stealth Sea Lions being offloaded from 2 Air Force C-5M Super Galaxies. A SEAL team had arrived a day earlier from Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Sea Lions were experimental stealth commando boats and had never become operational. Each boat measured 71 feet long and required 2 sailors to operate it. Each was a semi-submersible, which meant that once loaded with SEALs and weapons, it could submerge until only the pilot house, a stealth shape that dispersed radar waves trying to locate it, was above water, and carry its commandos and their weapons into a beach or other landing without the enemy being aware of its presence. Good for about 40 knots in calm water and a bit less in an unsettled sea, Sea Lions were the armored personnel carriers of the naval commandos. Captain Joe Child was in charge of the operation. The 2 Sea Lions were checked, and after necessary minor repairs were accomplished, taken out for night runs in Pearl Harbor. After more repairs and a minor modification to the internal lights, Joe Child pronounced himself satisfied, so the Sea Lions were loaded aboard USS Hornet, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship. While this was going on, USS Utah, a Virginia-class attack sub, got underway. Roscoe Hanna, still the skipper, was delighted to get the chance to take the boat to sea one more time. The destination was the Yellow Sea, near the Qingdao Naval Base, home of the Chinese Northern Fleet. Hanna consulted his charts and fretted over the problem. The Yellow Sea was shallow, and the naval base was at the end of the saltwater equivalent of a saucepan. Utah's job was to make sure that there were no Chinese submarines near the area that might interfere with the SEAL's mission. Naval intelligence didn't think the Chinese had either acoustic sensors at the mouth of the harbor or submarine nets. The Chinese did, however, have patrol boats equipped with sonar and searchlights, plus small depth bombs that were certainly adequate to kill submerged swimmers if they were detected or suspected, and all the usual machine guns and submachine guns. "The problem," Hanna explained to his officers, "is that the bottom is damned shallow way out into the Yellow Sea. The Chinese don't think any fool would bring a submarine into water that shallow, and believe me, this fool wouldn't if there were any other way." "Why don't we just wait until the carrier sails, then torpedo her?" the XO asked. "Orders. Washington wants demolition charges. SEALs will plant them. Washington wants them detonated under the keel, so the ship can't be raised and repaired." "Sitting right at the pier?" "Minimize the loss of life, yet break her back, sink her. That's the mission." "Who did the Chinese piss off, Captain?" "Just about everybody who is anybody." Hanna didn't know why Washington wanted the Chinese carrier sunk, but he suspected it had something to do with the recent debacle in Norfolk. No one had ever mentioned that a nuclear weapon had been found there, a fact that was highly classified and would never be confirmed by the United States government. But where there was that much smoke, one suspected there was at least a little fire of some kind. "People way above our pay grade decided on this mission," Roscoe Hanna told his officers. "So we're going. Orders are orders. Aye, aye, sir." While Utah ran across the western Pacific 1,500 feet below the surface at 25 knots, Hornet and her 3 escorts, all destroyers with guided missiles for protection from Chinese fighters, prepared to get underway. Already in the East China Sea was an aircraft carrier, USS United States, with her battle group. Her aircraft were aloft day and night, around the clock. E-2s, satellites, and shipboard radars were watching all the aerial traffic over that ocean, and the ships that sailed those waters. Every plane and ship was assigned a track number and watched. During the day, FA-18 Hornets did flybys and photographed the ships, and occasionally intercepted aircraft that were thought to be Chinese military. All this was out of the ordinary, and the admiral in charge of the battle group, Rear Admiral Toad Tarkington, worried that too much vigilance would make the Chinese suspect that something was in the wind. Still, with the recent aggressive moves by the plan against a P-8A Poseidon on patrol, and at Scarborough Shoals, maybe this was the expected U.S. reaction. He hoped so anyway, and kept signing the operations plan. The northern Pacific in January was a stormy ocean, with cold air, clouds, snow or rain, high sea states, and low visibility. Many of the sailors on the ships in the small task force centered around Hornet became seasick. Captain Joe Child was one of them. He found the endless pitching, rolling, and heaving of the amphibious assault ship impossible to endure inside. So he went to the flight deck and found a place behind a mobile crane where he could huddle out of the wind. The cold air and the openness seemed to help somewhat, but the howling wind and snow made even that refuge a miserable place. Finally, he went to the doctor and got some pills. Threw them up. The third time he kept them down, and they seemed to help. The nausea stopped. For the first time in 4 days, he felt like eating. In the wardroom, he ran into the doctor, who asked, "How you doing, Captain?" "Better, I think. The pills are working." "I thought I gave you suppositories." "Pills." The doctor nodded distractedly as if trying to remember. "Okay, but I can't remember whether I gave you placebos or the real stuff. You might just be getting used to the ride." "Thanks, Quack. We're trying to do our part to keep medical costs down." Grafton called me in one day and asked if I wanted to go to Singapore. I told him I didn't. He told me why he wanted me to go, so I said, sure, as if I had a choice. The brass can send you anywhere on the planet by nodding their heads. Grafton was just being polite. I was just being me. Singapore. I thought maybe I could stop in California on the way home and visit with Mom for a day or two. I stopped into Sarah's office and popped the question. "Want to go to Singapore for a few days? Stop in California on our way back? Meet the family?" She gave me the eye. "Really?" "Yeah." We had been dating a little bit, off and on, and sleeping together occasionally, but I was pretty much living with Willie at his place in the bowels of Washington. I was going to have to do something about that one of these days, but I thought Sarah and I should get our relationship figured out first. "Be a chance for us to get to know each other better," I told her. "This is so damned romantic I can't resist," she said, tossing her forearm across her forehead. "You've swept me off my feet." "Okay, I'll go." So the government sent me, and we split the cost of Sarah's airfare. There was an odd penny left over, which I paid so she wouldn't think I was cheap. We flew to L.A., and from there all the way to Singapore. One thing was certain. Sarah and I knew each other a lot better when we staggered off that flying cattle car. The hotel was everything I hoped for. A monstrous high-rise with a vast atrium. It was over-the-top opulent. Perfect for well-heeled embezzlers seeking to get away from it all or Japanese businessmen on generous expense accounts. The rooms were actually two-room suites. The bed was king-sized. We were on the 23rd floor, and the view out the window took in most of the downtown. If God ever gets out this way, he'll probably stay in this hotel or one like it. 2 days after we arrived, on the morning that Sarah had a visit to the spa scheduled, I went to the city morgue and asked to view a body. I gave them the number of the cold tray. They led me into a meat locker with lots of drawers. They pulled out the drawer with the number that I had given them, and I took a look. Yep, Zoe Carey. Someone had put a bullet into the side of her head. She didn't look good, but corpses rarely do. Just to be on the safe side, I asked for an ink pad and a couple of sheets of paper. Inked up the tips of her fingers on the right hand, pressed them against both sheets. Thanked the attendant and left. Didn't make a formal identification. Didn't ask what they were going to do with the body. None of that. I took a taxi over to the American Embassy and asked for a fellow whose name Jake Grafton had given me. At my request, he gave me 2 envelopes. I put the fingerprints in them, addressed one to Jake Grafton and one to Harry Estep at the FBI. The envelopes would go into the diplomatic bag. I strolled out of the embassy feeling rather bucked with life. Zoe Carey had gone on to her reward. I speculated about who might have popped her. The Chinese were the most likely suspects, I thought. She had been in the game for the bucks and knew too much. Loose lips sink ships, or so they say. After Sarah came out of the spa, we had a leisurely lunch and drank a bottle of wine at a window table in the 4-star restaurant on the top floor of the hotel, then went downstairs to spend the afternoon naked in bed. I was just another civil servant on per diem. It's good work if you can get it. Just after dusk, one miserable late January night in the Yellow Sea, the amphibious assault ship Hornet opened her rear doors, and 2 sea lions carrying seals backed out of the well. They circled around a time or two, checking systems, then joined into a loose formation and headed west. The coxswains flooded tanks until the decks were below the waterline and only the small, stealthy pilot houses were above water. Above water occasionally, because swells washed over the small pilot house windows from time to time, obliterating the coxswain's view. Down and aft, the SEALs in their wetsuits tried not to puke. The motion of the semi-submersibles was rather severe. Some of them lost their cookies anyway. Captain Joe Child was doing okay, no doubt because he took 2 of the doctor's anti-nausea pills a half hour before embarking. He too was wearing a wetsuit just in case, but he was not going out unless he had to. He was the commander of this operation, with 3 encrypted satellite phones available to call just about anyone on the planet, including Admiral Toad Tarkington aboard USS United States, the admiral in charge of the Hornet Task Force and headquarters in Pearl and Washington. He knew there was a nuke sub prowling around out here someplace, USS Utah, but since she was submerged, he had no way to communicate directly with her. Before he left, however, he had read the latest report from SubPac, which said that Utah had found no Chinese submarines operating in the area. The Chinese had been tracking Hornet's little task force with aerial reconnaissance and radar, of course, but the official word released in South Korea and the States was that the task force was part of the American contingent in these waters to participate in an annual combined Republic of Korea-U.S. military exercise held at this time every year since the Korean armistice in 1953. Captain Child and the 5 SEALs in his boat settled down for the 4-hour ride to Qingdao. The officer in charge of the second boat was Lieutenant Howie Peavy. His team's task was to actually plant the demolition charges under the keel of Liaoning, as near the center of the ship as possible. He had 400 pounds of explosives stored in the bottom of his Sea Lion, broken down into 50-pound waterproof bags equipped with electromagnets to hold them in place. No doubt Liaoning's hull was encrusted with barnacles, seaweed, and rust, so a conventional magnet wouldn't be able to get a grip. Without some way to attach the charges, the team would need a lot more explosives. Just in case, Captain Child's Sea Lion also carried 400 pounds of demolition charges, which all concerned hoped would not be needed. Riding just awash, with only the little cockpit above water some of the time, the Sea Lions pitched and corkscrewed through the sea. The smell of vomit filled the air. Child stood behind the coxswain in his raised chair to see what he could see. The photonics mast was up to full extension. The picture from that was displayed on a multifunction display in front of the coxswain. There wasn't much to see on the MFD or through the windows. It was really dark out there. Water from every swell washed over the bulletproof glass surrounding the coxswain. The coxswain had electronic help to stay separated from the other Sea Lion and a GPS to keep him on course. No radar, of course. If a ship or boat should loom out of the night, the ride would get very exciting very quickly. Child checked his watch for the 100th time and looked at the GPS presentation, and once again took his seat. He tried to relax, to think about the mission and all the myriad of contingencies, which were things that could go wrong. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. No good. The boat was writhing like a living beast. So he sat and rode it, just like the 6 men sitting behind him in the dark. Waiting is the hard part. Seems like most of life is spent waiting. What was it the Admiral had said? Your mission is to sink that aircraft carrier. The Chinese will know we did it. So do whatever you must to make that happen and get all your people out. You can't leave anyone behind. We can't give them a live man or a dead body to display to the press. That is of utmost importance." "SEALs don't leave people behind," Child answered brusquely. Rear Admiral Hewlett Hurricane Carter scrutinized his face and nodded. "Do what you have to do to accomplish your mission and bring your people back, whatever it takes." "Aye, aye, sir." "Good luck," the Admiral said and shook his hand. Whatever it takes. God, they were really pissed at the Chinese. It was about 10 in the evening local time when the coxswain blew the water from the tanks of Joe Child's Sea Lion, lifting it from its semi-submerged condition and exposing the full length of the deck. The SEALs opened the hatches and came out on deck. They were wearing black wetsuits with a balaclava and goggles that magnified ambient light or saw in infrared. In short order, they inflated 2 rubber rafts called Zodiacs, got them in the water, and began passing weapons to the man in the boat. One of the SEALs went into the water carrying a rope. He swam 10 yards to the rocks of the breakwater, the mole, that formed the outer edge of the harbor, climbed up on it and began pulling a loaded Zodiac toward him. 10 minutes after the Sea Lion arrived, the SEALs had a Browning .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a tripod on the mole, and ammo belts ready. A petty officer manned this gun, and Child was his loader and backup. The other 4 spread out. One carried an M3 Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, a Goose, that fired an 84mm warhead, portable artillery, while his teammate carried a half-dozen warheads and a silenced submachine gun. The other 2 SEALs carried a .50 caliber Barrett sniper rifle with a starlight scope. Their job was to keep any Chinese patrol boat that found the other Sea Lion occupied if necessary as a diversion. Joe Child stood by the machine gun and used binoculars to examine the ships in the harbor, which were lit with night running lights as usual. The carrier was quite prominent, easily the biggest ship in the harbor. She was about 1 kilometer away, moored against a long, well-lit quay filled with warehouses and cranes. Other naval vessels were at other piers, 3 destroyers, some patrol craft, several supply ships. Joe Child turned on his portable comm device. The screen was backlit, as were the keys. He could type a message and the device would scramble it, then send it in a burst transmission to bounce off a satellite, or he could receive scrambled burst transmissions, which would be unscrambled and displayed in plain English on the screen. Finally, he could just use the device as a conventional handheld radio. He typed in his message, a mere code word that told all recipients that his team was on station and all was going as planned. He hit the send button, which fired it into cyberspace. Aboard USS Hornet, Admiral Hurricane Carter looked at the message on the big computer presentation in the Combat Information Center and nodded. Aboard USS United States, Admiral Toad Tarkington did the same thing. Then both officers asked their aides for another cup of coffee. Both ships were at flight quarters, which meant the flight decks were manned and flight crews were dressed and standing by in their respective ready rooms, ready to fly. Hornet had 6 AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters, sometimes called Zulu Cobras after their Super Cobra parent, armed and ready to launch. Carter asked his operations officer, "How far are we from Qingdao?" 120 nautical miles, he was told. "Close to 100. He said. With a full combat load, the Zulu Cobras would sweat every mile if they had to launch. Carter prayed that they wouldn't be needed. Aboard the large carrier, 16 FA-18 Hornets and 2 EA-18G Growlers were fueled, armed, and ready for engine start. United States, call sign Battlestar, was just south of Jeju Island, northeast of Shanghai. Qingdao was within the combat radius of her air wing. Still, she had 2 tankers on deck, ready to launch if necessary. Half a world away from the Yellow Sea in Washington, it was mid-morning. At Sal Molina's request, Jake Grafton joined him in the White House Situation Room, which was, appropriately enough, in the basement of the Executive Mansion. Admiral McKiernan and the Marine Commandant were there, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The President was not in sight. Jurgen Schultz, the National Security Advisor and erstwhile Harvard professor, was in a foul mood. He lit on Grafton like a starving mosquito. "You talked him into this," he said accusingly, the him, of course, being the president. "You gotta take your medication every morning," Jake said. "Don't forget those pills." He turned his back on an enraged Schultz and wandered over to the coffee pot. "Where's the prez?" Grafton whispered to Molina. "Fundraising in California. Squeezing in a little golf." "Great." Peter Siliberti, the coxswain of the Sea Lion that was supposed to deliver the demolition charges to Liao Ning, informed Howie Peavy that there was a problem. "They got a net around this thing, sir. We can't get any closer." Lieutenant Peavy looked at the picture from the photonics mast. "We're still what, 100 yards away?" "About that, I think." "Seen any patrol boats?" "One. He went by the carrier as we were coming in and went on toward the dry dock off to the north." "Well, better lift her up so we can open the hatches and get the charges out. If you can put us alongside the net, we'll hop over it." He and Siliberti rotated the photonics mast in a 360-degree circle, looking at everything they could see in ambient light, then did it again in infrared. The carrier was tied up sideways to the quay, her bow to the south, Peavy's left, and well lit up. In infrared, she had all the usual hot spots, as did most of the ships at pierside, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, alarming. Magnifying the image, Peavy could see 2 machine guns along the rail, one forward, one aft, each manned by one sailor. The guns seemed to be on swivel mounts, so they were probably of a fairly large caliber, the equivalent of a .50 caliber Browning machine gun. The problem was the gunners. He wondered how vigilant they were. The carrier's masthead and deck lights were behind the gunners, so they couldn't see more than 50 or 60 yards from the ship, he thought. However, there were 4 lights on cables dangling from the catwalks, hanging down to about 20 feet above the water. Each cast a nice circle of light on the water. If a swimmer came up in one of those circles of light and the gunners saw him, well, they would have to stay submerged, or take out the gunners. "Take us up," Peavy said to Siliberti, and patted him on the shoulder. "And keep an eye out for that patrol boat." As the coxswain did his job, Peavy briefed his team. 6 men in black wetsuits wearing flippers over their dive boots, and LAR-5 Draeger rebreathers on their backs so they would not release bubbles of exhaled gases into the water, as conventional scuba gear did. The rebreathers used a pure oxygen system and filtered carbon dioxide from the exhaled air. Up on deck, Peavy took another look around. The night was dark as the inside of a coal mine, overcast, cold, with a stiff breeze blowing those swells lapping up against the hull of the Sea Lion. The divers were going to have to work with headlamps to plant the charges. Peavy would need even more light to set the fuses and timer. Using lights was a risk, but as black as the water was under that ship, there was no way they could do the job by feel. The good news, Howie Peavy thought, was that the reduced visibility in the water, probably about 2 feet, and the spotlights hanging from the catwalks over the water, would mean that no one on the surface would see the lights. He hoped. He slipped into the water inside the net, made sure his rebreathing gear was working properly, and reached up for the first 50-pound demolition charge. It almost drove him to the bottom, but once it was in the water, it became much easier to handle. He turned, sighted on the middle of the carrier, checked his compass, and began swimming toward it on the surface, towing the charge. 50 yards from the carrier, he submerged. Standing on the mole jutting from the land to form the entrance to the harbor, Captain Joe Child could see the harbor patrol boat making its rounds. He watched it through binoculars. The boat had running and masthead lights and some kind of deck light. He could see at least 4 men on the thing. One of them was using a large spotlight, playing it across the water randomly. If they found something, it should be obvious, he thought. So he watched. After that Sea Lion ride, he thought he would never want to sit again, but after 10 minutes or so of scanning with binoculars, he decided he did. He lowered himself to the damp concrete and braced his elbows on his knees, which steadied the binoculars somewhat. "We have subsurface contact, Captain," the sonar operator, a first-class petty officer, said to Roscoe Hanna. "Sounds like an attack boat. Relative bearing 330 degrees, perhaps 6,000 yards. Hanna looked at the computer plot. The contact was on the plot now, but the range was just an estimate, and would be until the contact could be tracked for a while through various bearings. They were 50 miles east of the Qingdao Naval Base, running north at 3 knots. The other boat was heading southeast, in the general direction of the American task force. This close to the Chinese mainland, that was inevitable perhaps.
"Are we alone?"
Hannah asked everyone in the control room. The sonar operators were listening, and all agreed that the submarine at 330 degrees relative was their only contact. The sea was so shallow, sound bouncing around. "It sounds like a Chinese attack boat, Captain. Nuclear."
"Let's get behind him," the Utah skipper said. "We'll let him cross our bows, then we'll fall in behind him."
Hannah glanced at his watch. In 2 or 3 hours, the sea lions would be coming out of Qingdao.
"Let's make sure this boat is the only Chinese sub out here, people," Hannah said, "or we're going to be the guys with egg on our faces."
Hannah was assuming the crew of the Chinese boat hadn't yet heard Utah. If they had, they wouldn't mosey along as if they were alone for very long. He would soon know. Swimming underwater, towing demolition charges, moving them into position, activating the electromagnets that would hold them in place, all the time working under the vast black bulk of the aircraft carrier. It took tremendous physical exertion from every member of the team. Peavy had to swim from the bow to the stern, watching his watch, then reverse himself and swim half that time to find the midpoint of the ship's hull. All this took time, yet while he was doing it, other team members were assembling with explosive charges. The water was as black as the grave under that huge ship. The turbidity of the water prevented any light from the dangling spotlights from reaching the keel. Howie Peavy and his team members used headlamps. They had to. It was absolutely critical that they got all the explosives as close together as possible, and right on the keel, the deepest part of the ship. Determining just where the keel was in that dark, opaque water was a difficult task. The roundness of the hull certainly didn't help, because there was no way to determine exactly where the deepest part was. Peavy and his team worked until they thought they had it. Every man got a vote by gesture and light. When the charges were all placed, Peavy and one other diver began rigging the fuses and timer. It was the harbor patrol boat that caused the ruckus. Joe Child sat watching it and was appalled to see that it was coming south, working right along the anti-torpedo net that had been rigged to protect Liaoning. Of course, the coxswain of PV Sea Lion saw it coming. Ciliberti had a great view on his photonics display, and if he didn't trust digital magic, he could turn in his seat and look north at the real thing coming his way. Ciliberti had already flooded his tanks and submerged the boat as far as it would go, which was down to the glass of the pilot house. But the patrol boat was coming lazily on, perhaps at 2 or 3 knots, with the spotlight swinging back and forth, back and forth. He had to do something, so he got his Sea Lion underway and turned 90 degrees to seaward to clear the net. Perhaps he could allow the patrol boat to go by, then turn in behind him and join on the net again. What Ciliberti couldn't do was abandon the seals that were now under Liaoning. He keyed his portable comm unit, which was in a bracket glued to the instrument panel. "Gold 1, this is Blue 2. I have a problem. I'm clearing the net, but this boat is coming down on me." "Roger," Joe Child acknowledged. The patrol boat was only 100 yards or so from the Sea Lion's last position on the net. Child glanced at his watch. The divers had been in the water for over an hour. How much longer before they were ready to be recovered? "How far?" Child asked the gunner on the Browning, who was holding a laser rangefinder up to his eye. "Gonna be about 800 meters, sir," the gunner said. Child used his comm unit. "Gold 4, give them a goose round. Gold 6, use the Barrett on those machine gunners aboard the flat top if they fire a single shot." Mic clicks were his reply. 15 seconds later, the M3 spit out its round. Watching through the binoculars, Joe Child saw the little shaped charge explode on the front left quarter of the patrol boat. The boat began slewing as if it were out of control. No one forward now on the gun. The spotlight wasn't sweeping anymore. That had been an armor-piercing round, one that would kill a medium-sized tank. Child wondered what it had done to the hull of the boat. Now she straightened out and accelerated. Child could see the bow rise onto the plane. The boat's heading began to wander. The helmsman was probably wounded or dead.
"Hit him again," he said on the radio.
The rocket missed. The boat continued on, closing the distance. Captain Child tapped the machine gunner on the shoulder.
"Take him out."
The machine gun began squirting short bursts. The gunner knew his stuff. Through his binoculars, Child could see sparks where bullets were hitting the boat and pieces flying off. On the fifth burst, the boat exploded. As the fireball rose into the night sky, illuminating the area around the boat, the wreckage drifted to a stop. The fire quickly went out as the boat sank. The harbor was dark again. Except on the ships berthed against the piers and quay. Searchlights came on, claxons wailed. Oriental voices could be heard talking over PA systems. The crews were being called to action stations. Joe Child wondered how much more time Howie Peavy needed. He wondered how quickly the berthed ships could be gotten to sea. He wondered how many more patrol boats were sitting at a pier, ready to cast off. He wondered if he should alert the admirals in charge of the task forces. He decided to alert them with a message on his comm unit. Typing it would keep him busy doing something productive. USS Utah slid in behind the Chinese hunter-killer sub at about 4 miles distance. If the Chinese boat was towing a sonar array, Roscoe Hanna didn't want to hit it. Once safely behind the Chinaman, Hanna accelerated a bit to match his speed. A submarine's stern was its dead zone, the sounds behind it hidden by the turning screws and disturbed water of its passing. The boat they were trailing would undoubtedly turn sooner or later to clear his stern, his baffles, but probably not for a while.
"Any other boats around?"
"No, sir." No one had been reported, but Hanna thought it never hurt to ask a direct question and make everyone look again. Hanna checked the plot. The 2 subs seemed to be heading for the Hornet task group, which was only 40 miles away. At 10 knots, they would be there in 4 hours if they held this course. Of course, Hornet was moving too. For whatever it was worth, they were already in Hornet's vicinity.
"How are the sound conditions?"
Hanna asked his sonar guru.
"Not good. Too shallow."
The sound conditions would be equally bad for the Chinese boat, Hanna thought. The clock on the bulkhead was ticking off the minutes. Captain Hanna sat on a stool where he could see the automated plot and waited. As the SEALs got their demolition charges attached, they went back in pairs for the last ones, until all 8 50-pound charges were attached under the keel. Then the 2 superfluous pairs of divers swam back to the Sea Lion, which had returned to the net after the passage of the harbor patrol boat. It was very difficult working in the blackness under the ship, with only 10 feet of water between the bottom and the keel, with visibility about a foot. Howie Peavy and his mate, Petty Officer 2nd Class Macon George, installed the fuses in each charge, attached the timer to the ship, and ensured the clock was working. Peavy was ready to set the timer when George grabbed his arm and motioned that his rebreather was going bad. Together, the 2 men swam upward toward the surface. They came up right against the hull of the ship. Lights dangling from the catwalk 40 feet above lit the surface and dazzled the divers, whose eyes had not adjusted. Still, it was doubtful if anyone on the catwalk was looking straight down at the waterline.
"We can't stay here,"
Peavy told George.
"You stay here and I'll go back and set the timer. Then we'll share the mouthpiece and swim back together."
A thumbs up. Peavy turned and flippered down, just in time to feel the whap of a bullet hitting the water near him. Very near. He grabbed Macon George's feet and dragged him under. George was using his hands to help get under the surface, so the 2 went down together. Peavy took a deep breath, passed the mouthpiece to George, who put it in his mouth, spit the water out around the edge, exhaled, took a deep breath and passed it back. The 2 men swam back down to the keel and had to hunt for the damn charges. They had drifted too much toward the stern, Peavy realized, and turned George and swam back along the keel. Taking turns breathing, they set the timer for 30 minutes. Then Peavy checked his compass, and they swam away underwater in the direction of the Sea Lion. The cold water was getting to both men. They were very tired, lethargic. They couldn't quit. They swam on, holding hands, trading the mouthpiece, checking the compass every few strokes in that dark, cold, wet universe. Although they didn't know it, The Chinese sailors at the machine guns on the catwalks had opened fire on the surface of the water. They had no target, just sprayed bullets back and forth. Petty Officer First Class Jack Brumlick was settled in with the Barrett sniper rifle on the mole. He was lying prone. He turned the rifle and aimed at the muzzle flashes, touched off one of those 50 caliber rounds. The muzzle flashes stopped. He waited for the starlight scope to adjust, saw the gunner looking wildly about, and put the crosshairs on him, squeezed ever so gently, and felt the rifle smack him in the shoulder. When he recovered from the recoil and looked again, the man was not visible. "The other one," his spotter said. "Shoot him too." Jack Brumlick aimed and touched off his weapon. A first shot hit. "Let's move," the spotter said urgently. "They'll be shooting back." Brumlick scrambled up and grabbed the rifle, and they ran 50 yards along the mole, closer to the sea lion and the machine gun on a tripod. When Howie Peavy and Macon George got to the net and surfaced, they found the sea lion was 50 feet or so to the north. Holding on to the net, they worked their way along it, then climbed it to the deck. The hatch was open. Peavy shoved George in, then shouted down, "Count off!" 5 men answered. Peavy made 6, plus the coxswain. Peavy took off his rebreather and mask, dropped them through the hatch, then climbed down and dogged the hatch behind him. "Let's get the hell out of here," he roared at the coxswain, and then counted heads again. Yep, he had everyone. He went forward and climbed up beside the coxswain. "Message the ship. Give them the code. Mission complete, exiting the area." "Yes, sir." Peavy smacked the coxswain on the shoulder, then went aft to check on his men. Aboard Hornet and United States, the admirals ordered the ready sorties to launch. The Sea Lions might need air cover on the trip back to Hornet. Aboard the Sea Lion that was clearing Qingdao Bay, Howie Peavy looked at his watch. 7 minutes to go. Meanwhile, Captain Joe Child was supervising the reloading of the Zodiacs, then the transfer of the weapons to his ride, the Sea Lion with coxswain Peter Siliberti at the helm. It took a while. Child was about ready to go down the ladder and dog the hatch behind him when the charges under Liao Ning went off with a thud. He could feel it through the water first, then the air. Not too loud. He stood mesmerized, watching the carrier tied to the quay through his binoculars. Her lights were still lit. Some water had been squirted aloft, and he could see the cloud of it illuminated by the deck lights. Then it dissipated. Nothing happened. The lights stayed lit. Child didn't know what to expect. Obviously, she wouldn't go down like a torpedoed freighter in an old Victory at Sea movie. But shouldn't she be doing something? Maybe they got the charges in the wrong place. Maybe they didn't use enough explosive. Maybe... Then he realized the middle of the ship was lower, the bow and stern higher. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the middle settled and the bow and stern seemed to rise. Liao Ning was only going to do a little bit of that, Child realized, before the middle of the ship hit the bottom mud. Her keel was broken. She was in 2 halves. Child jabbed a fist aloft, went down the ladder and dogged the hatch, and shouted exultantly, "They did it! Broke her back! Let's get the hell out of here, coxswain!" Child personally typed the success code into his comm unit and hit the send button. When he finished, he turned and saw that every man there was grinning widely. Yes. Aboard Utah, the sonar man had the audio of his gear on the control room speaker, with the volume turned way down. It was here that Roscoe Hanna and the control room crew heard a sonar ping from one of the destroyers around Hornet. 1 ping, pause, 2 pings, pause, 2 more. Then silence again. The success signal. That meant the 2 Sea Lions were on their way back to Hornet. Hanna glanced again at the plot. The Chinese attack boat was still 4 miles in front of them, still heading a little south of east toward the Hornet task group. Hanna decided to wait until the Chinese boat heard the oncoming Sea Lions, which weren't quiet. When the Chinese heard them, they would do something. Hanna didn't know what, but the unknown sound coming from the direction of Qingdao might tempt the Chinese skipper to take his boat to periscope depth for a look around. It would be at least an hour before the Sea Lions were close enough to hear. Roscoe Hanna took a head break. It was mid-afternoon in Washington when Rear Admiral Hurricane Carter notified the Pentagon and White House of the success of the SEAL mission. In the White House Situation Room, the civilian staffers and bigwigs made a happy noise, then wandered out. Finally, only the permanent Situation Room staffers were left, and Admiral Cart McKiernan and Jake Grafton. They sat side by side in chairs at the back of the room. Those two didn't get excited when the news was announced. They wouldn't get excited until the SEALs were back aboard Hornet. They wandered over to the coffee pot, helped themselves, and inspected the stale donut and bagel selection. McKiernan paused to whack Grafton on the arm with his fist. Grafton gave him a grin. Then each took a chunk of carbohydrates and a cup of sour coffee back to his seat and tried to get comfortable. Utah heard the sea lions at least 10 minutes before the Chinese attack submarine in front of her reacted by turning so her right flank was fully exposed to the noisemakers. Silently, slowing carefully, Utah continued on course until she could once again turn in behind her prey. Roscoe Hanna knew precisely what he was going to do. The only thing he worried about was the timing. When? So he waited until the oncoming sea lions were about 5 miles away at 2 o'clock relative to him. They were going to cross in front of the Chinese boat, with the closest point of approach being 3 miles. "Now," Hanna said, and the sonar man flipped the switch to active pinging. Ping. The sound went out and returned. The Chinese sub blossomed on the screen. Another ping, and another regularly. The Chinese sub was pinned. "Noisemakers," Hanna ordered, and 3 acoustic buoys were launched from small tubes in the sail. They shot away from Utah, then slowed and began making wondrous amounts of noise that would overwhelm the sensitive listening sensors of the Chinese sub, at least for a few moments. The results of all this, Hanna hoped, was confusion. At the least, he thought the Chinese skipper would forget about the surface contacts he had detected and worry about the origin of all this noise. No doubt it was another submarine, but where? "Open outer doors on tubes 1 and 2. The fact that Utah was going to shoot 2 torpedoes had been briefed and rehearsed. Now the commands went right down the checklist. "Fire 1. Everyone in the control room felt the jolt of the big torpedo being ejected. 10 seconds later, "Fire 2. The second torpedo went into the water. Now Hanna ceased pinging and turned his boat to port to present its stern to the Chinese boat and open the distance. Aboard the Chinese sub, confusion reigned. The active pinging of a subsurface sonar so near had come as a shock to the entire crew. Then the noisemakers. They knew where the other sub was, or thought they did, but why all the noise? While the skipper was trying to figure it out, the sonar operator called out, "Torpedo running! Active homing! Approaching!" The Chinese sub wasn't even at action stations. The OOD in the control room smacked the collision alarm with his palm, and the noise rang in every compartment in the boat. The captain grabbed the headset from the sonar man, put one pad against his ear. He could hear the distinctive gurgle of the approaching torpedo. He grabbed the volume knob and turned. The torpedo was close, seconds from impact. He could hear the pinging of its seeker head. "Surface!" he shouted. "Emergency surface!" He tossed the headset back to the sonar man, who flipped a switch and put the audio on the loudspeaker system. Bedlam in the control room, everyone shouting and reaching for knobs and buttons as the torpedo closed. The sound of the approaching torpedo was rising in pitch and volume as it sped toward the submarine. The pinging from the seeker came faster and faster as the range diminished. Then, whump! A noise like the impact of a huge hammer. The torpedo struck the outside of the boat and didn't explode. The noise from the seeker head and the pump jet propulsion system fell silent. But there was another torpedo in the water. Like the first, it roared in with its pinging head probing for the sub, whining louder and louder. Whump. Silence. 2 duds. Or 2 practice torpedoes. "Level off at this depth," the captain roared. "Get the boat under control. And where is that Yankee sub?" While the ocean floor was shallow here, Roscoe Hanna thought he could safely take Utah a little deeper So he had the chief drop her down another 100 feet. Perhaps he would get a bit of help from a thermal layer if there was one, or a discontinuity in salinity. A minute passed, then 2.
More speed, Hannah told the chief of the boat. 20 knots.
Aye, aye, sir. 20 knots. The noisemakers had hidden the sound of the practice torpedoes, but he figured he got 2 hits at the end of running time, and gave the Chinese skipper the thrill of his life. Hannah turned the boat so he was heading straight for the center of the Hornet task group. Now the Chinese boat went active on its sonar. Ping. It was turning toward Utah. If the Chinese skipper fires a torpedo, this will be World War III. But he won't, Hannah told himself. He'd been surprised, humiliated, lost a bucket of face, but he won't pull the trigger. I hope. He's accelerating, Captain, sonar reported.
Range?
About 5 miles, sir.
Give me a real hard starboard turn, Chief. I want to turn and point our nose right in front of him and go charging in like we're gonna ram.
Yes, sir.
Start pinging, sonar. I want to go close, but I don't want to trade paint.
Yes, sir. The deck tilted as the chief had the helmsman bring Utah hard starboard. She came around like an airplane with her planes and rudder biting the water with a fierce grip. Then she straightened out.
Faster, Chief. Another 10 knots, I think.
The Chinese boat was a bit to the left and perhaps 50 feet above them. The distances became stark as the 2 submarines rushed together, now at a combined speed of almost 50 knots, about 60 miles per hour.
When we are 1 mile apart, we turn her, Chief, to port, go down his starboard side. We will fire more noisemakers as we pass.
And that is what they did. They fired 3 more noisemakers as they were abeam the Chinese sub, then hit the turbulence she had left in her wake. The boat bucked and writhed. No doubt the Chinese sailors were also getting bounced around in Utah's wake.
Passive on the sonar, Roscoe Hannah said. Turn us to the south, Chief, and let's get the hell out of here as fast as we can go.
When the 4 Zulu Cobras from Hornet rendezvoused with the eastbound Sea Lions, 2 sections of FA-18 Hornets were already overhead. The helicopters were under the overcast, flying at about 1,000 feet. Their position lights twinkled in the vast darkness over the night sea. Above the overcast, the fighters were probing the night with their radars, while being illuminated by Chinese search radars. The pilots could hear the baritone tones as the radar beams swept over them. This information was data linked to an E-2 Hawkeye in an orbit at 30,000 feet over United States, and from there passed to the Combat Information Center and flag plot aboard the ship. From there it went by satellite to the White House Situation Room, where Cart McKiernan and Jake Grafton were watching. Real-time text messages from Captain Joe Child and Lieutenant Howie Peavy scrolled across one of the large projection screens. The SEAL raid had been a success. All the men were coming out. They had egressed after sinking a harbor patrol boat and taking out several machine gunners aboard Liao Ning.
A nice job, the CNO muttered.
At the duty desk, one of the officers was on the telephone, no doubt briefing Sal Molina. Grafton and the Admiral watched as 2 bogies climbed away from an airfield near Qingdao Naval Base in real time, rendezvoused and headed out to sea, eastbound and climbing. McKiernan looked at his watch.
The SEALs cracked that keel 2.5 hours ago. Since then, the plan has been trying to figure out what happened and what to do about it.
These 2 had discussed all this, of course, before they went to see the President for approval of the SEAL raid. The Chinese will be surprised, embarrassed, and probably outraged, Grafton argued. Yet they won't shoot unless they are fired upon. No Chinese officer is going to take the responsibility for starting World War III. You hope, Jurgen Schultz glowered. The Secretary of State, Owen Lancaster, cleared his throat. He was a white-haired Brahmin who had been helping hold up the New England end of the establishment for at least 50 years. Although no one knew how he voted, if he did, he had been routinely appointed to key ambassadorships by 30 years' worth of presidents. This president had elevated him to run the State Department, to the relief of a great many Americans who expected another party hack. Lancaster was no fan of Jake Grafton, with whom he had crossed swords several times in the past. Still, he eyed McKiernan and Grafton carefully, then spoke to the President.
The Chinese need to be taught a lesson. That bomb in Norfolk was a gambit approved at the very top. We can't let it pass. If we do, sooner or later we will be in a shooting war in the Far East, or we will be run out of there with our tails between our legs. We must make our choice now. Tomorrow will be too late.
The president deferred to Lancaster.
Do it, he told Cart
McKiernan. So Grafton and McKiernan had gotten their permission. Now they sat in the back row of the White House Situation Room, watching jets rush together over the Yellow Sea, and hoped they had correctly predicted the Chinese reaction. Yet neither man was really worried. Even if some Chinese pilot opened fire, he would quickly go into the sea, and cooler heads would prevail in Beijing. Political provocations are wonderful PR for the home folks, but when one encounters naked steel, it is time to reassess. Are you ready to fight? The two American sections of Hornets, 2 fighters in each section, turned so that the Chinese formation went between them. Then they turned hard to come in at an angle from each side, a classic rendezvous. But as the Chinese pilots knew, the Americans were in their rear quadrant pulling lead. If the Americans chose to shoot, they were perfectly set up for it. The flight leader reported that the Chinese jets had their external lights on, as the American fighters did. Rear Admiral Toad Tarkington passed that comment on to Washington immediately, and both McKiernan and Grafton relaxed a bit when they heard it. The Chinese pilots had not been sent to shoot down an American plane or two. If they had, they would have never let the Americans get into a firing position. McKiernan slapped Grafton on the shoulder again and dug a pack of chewing gum out of his pocket. When the last of the helicopters and fighters were back aboard ship and Hornet had recovered her 2 sea lions, McKiernan and Grafton stood, stretched, and strolled out of the Situation Room. They met Sal Molina coming in. "We're going over to the Willard for steaks and drinks," Grafton told the president's man. "You want to come along?" He did. Late that night, the Willard valet at the door hailed taxis to take all 3 men home. Chapter 27. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. George Washington. Not a word of the events in Qingdao Harbor or the Yellow Sea that January night ever made it into print, the Internet, or broadcast radio or television. It was as if Liao Ning were still afloat. Satellite reconnaissance showed that she probably wasn't. 3 days after the event, the Chinese ambassador, who spoke excellent English, called on the State Department to deliver a note from the Chinese government. He was ushered into the office of the Secretary, Owen Lancaster. "Before you deliver your note, sir, I have something to show you," Lancaster said. "Then perhaps you and I can have a private, off-the-record discussion." Lancaster's limo was waiting. Without a word being said, the driver headed for Joint Base Andrews, the Air Force side. The limo was waved through toward a hangar surrounded by Air Force MPs wearing helmets and sidearms and carrying assault rifles. Some of them had dogs on leashes. A colonel escorted Lancaster and his guest into the hangar, which was empty except for a bomb dolly in the middle of the thing. The colonel let Lancaster and the ambassador proceed alone. Lancaster stopped beside the bomb dolly. "This, Mr. Ambassador, is a Chinese nuclear weapon. It was recovered from the Norfolk naval base, where it was submerged near the entrance to the harbor." "Mr. Secretary, I am unfamiliar with weapons. I have never even seen one. I have no idea what nation produced this one, if it is indeed a weapon." "Your government has been less than forthright with you, sir," Lancaster said. "This weapon was armed and within 2 hours of detonating when it was found. You were there in Norfolk, sir, and had it exploded, you would now be dead, along with several million Americans." "I repeat, sir, don't bother," Lancaster said, holding up his hand. "I feel somewhat certain that you called today at the State Department to lodge a protest about the sabotage of your aircraft carrier, Liao Ning, at the Qingdao Naval Base several days ago. Rest assured, sir, that the United States government knows no more about that incident than the government of the People's Republic knows about this weapon you see before you." The Chinese ambassador said nothing. Lancaster continued. However, it must be said, unofficially and off the record, privately from me to you, that certain people in our government thought it would be fitting and proper for this weapon, made in China, to be returned to China, placed under Liaoning, and detonated. Lancaster made a gesture. Although I know nothing about any of this, I assume that since I have not heard about a nuclear detonation in China, and since the weapon is physically right before us, such counsel was wisely rejected. Quite so, said the ambassador, who felt called upon to wipe his forehead. Unless you wish to take a photo or inspect the weapon more closely, I suggest we return to my office, where you can present your note. But when they returned to Foggy Bottom, the ambassador decided not to present the note. A week after the Liaoning incident, the Chinese government made a routine announcement. A new officer had been named head of the PLAN. What had happened to Admiral Wu wasn't mentioned, but intelligence agencies later learned that he was arrested on the order of the paramount leader, shot, and quietly buried. Sarah Houston and I flew home across the big pond. The truth is, I was sort of tuckered out from all the vacationing. I have never had all the sex I wanted, but when we boarded the plane in Singapore, I was perilously close to having had all I could stand, and I was kinda almost in love with Sarah Houston. I had been really in love once before with Anna Modine, and I knew the signs. I was having a devil of a time keeping my eyes off Sarah. Just looking at her and hearing her voice delighted me. It wasn't love yet, but maybe in time it might be. Anna was still a living presence with me, but she was gone. Forever. Life is for the living. Somehow I was going to have to get my head around those realities. Someday. We got off the plane in San Francisco, exhausted and jet-lagged to the max, retrieved our luggage, signed out a rental car, and set forth upon the highways. Sarah got busy with her cell phone as I drove. After a while, she announced,
"The President nominated Jake Grafton for Director of the CIA. Sent his name to the Senate."
We rode along silently, each of us thinking about that. We talked about what Grafton might have each of us doing. Mom seemed to like Sarah. She wanted to know all about Singapore, so we told her some lies. In fact, we hadn't seen much of it outside the hotel. I didn't mention the morgue.
"I've got a new boyfriend," Mom announced. "He'll be here for dinner in about an hour to meet you, Tommy, and of course Sarah."
I tried to be casual. "What happened to the old one? Bertie, what's his name?"
"We broke up right after you were here the last time, Tommy."
"Oh," I managed.
"Then he left a week or so ago. Moved away, apparently. They haven't seen him at the country club."
She shrugged.
"I hope he wasn't devastated by the breakup, but these things happen."
Sarah nodded sagely, and I said, "Oh," again. When I had recovered a bit, I said, as casually as I could, "So tell us about the new guy."
"You'll like him," she assured me. "He is reasonably good-looking, athletic, and very talented. Extraordinarily so."
"Talented at what?"
"He's a body artist,"
Mom told us as if it were a secret. A vision of some kinky sex thing flashed before my eyes. After all, I knew my mother. But maybe I was going too fast. "What's a body artist?" I asked.
"He does tattoos,"
Sarah told me with her eyebrows up. I gave my mom my best lying grin. "I hope it works out for you," I said. Sarah patted my arm.